Hey there, tonight we're exploring the leadership of Winston Churchill during the war. What you're about to discover is how his stirring speeches often masked the intense personal doubts he grappled with when the world seemed on the brink of collapse. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. Winston Churchill's early years were as rocky as a mountain goat's terrain, and just as stubbornly navigated. Born on November 30, 1874, in a drafty palace known as Blenheim, young Winston was a bundle of contradictions wrapped in a bowler hat. He was simultaneously the prodigal son of the aristocracy and the black sheep, a kid who seemed to have been born with a cigar in one hand and a copy of Shakespeare in the other. His school years were, to put it mildly, not exactly stellar. Churchill's academic record was so spotty it could have been mistaken for a Dalmatian. He bounced from school to school like a particularly troublesome billiard ball, finally landing at Harrow School. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, must have despaired at every report card, which read more like a plea for help than a list of achievements. Young Winston wasn't thick, mind you. He just found the traditional curriculum as exciting as a damp weekend in the English countryside. Latin verbs and algebraic equations had all the allure of a wet sock, but give him a history book or a chance to debate, and he'd light up like a Christmas tree. While most boys his age were busy memorizing the periodic table, Winston was busy crafting his own version of destiny, marked by a flair for the dramatic and a penchant for the kind of self-promotion that would make a modern-day influencer blush. Churchill's early brush with death is a story that sounds like it was plucked from a particularly thrilling novel. While he was still a teenager, he survived a near-fatal bout with pneumonia, an illness that was the Grim Reaper's favorite tool back in the day. Yet, this brush with mortality seemed to imbue Winston with a sense of purpose, or at least a sense of adventure. It was as if he decided that if he was going to shuffle off this mortal coil, he might as well make the most of the time he had. Fast forward a few years, and we find Winston Churchill in a dusty corner of South Africa, amidst the chaos of the Boer War. Here, he wasn't the pampered son of aristocrats. He was a war correspondent for the Morning Post, earning a handsome £250 a month, a king's ransom at the time. Churchill was a man on a mission, armed with a pen and a remarkable knack for getting himself into trouble. And boy, did he deliver. During one fateful train ambush, he was captured by the Boers, a situation that would make most people reconsider their career choices. But not Winston. Instead of resigning himself to a dreary prison sentence, he executed a daring escape that would make Houdini jealous. Under the cover of night, he scaled a wall and trekked nearly 300 miles to freedom, surviving on chocolate, biscuits, and sheer bloody-mindedness. This escapade turned him into a national hero overnight, because let's be honest, nothing screams future Prime Minister like a good old-fashioned jailbreak. This was classic Churchill, a man who could turn disaster into triumph with nothing more than grit and a well-timed headline. It was the kind of story that would be unbelievable if it weren't true, a narrative so perfectly tailored to the myth of Churchill that one wonders if he orchestrated the whole thing as a PR stunt. Ever the master of his own legend, Churchill knew how to spin a tale that would capture the public's imagination and, more importantly, their votes. His experiences in South Africa were more than just fodder for his burgeoning political career. They were a crucible in which his persona was forged. The young man who returned to England was not just a survivor, but a self-made hero with a knack for the grand narrative. His time as a war correspondent taught him more than just the art of survival. It taught him the power of narrative, the importance of being able to tell your own story before someone else does. So, what do we make of this young Winston Churchill? A schoolboy failure turned war correspondent, a man who knew how to turn a near-death experience into a stepping stone for greatness. He was a product of his time, yet a man seemingly out of step with it. His life was a series of contradictions, but each twist and turn only served to make his story more compelling. Perhaps that's the real genius of Churchill. his ability to shape his narrative with the same dexterity as he did the fate of nations. And if that isn't the mark of a wartime icon in the making, then what is? And so, with a head full of dreams and a quiver of anecdotes ready to be unleashed at dinner parties, Churchill returned to England, poised to leap into the political fray. The House of Commons beckoned like a carnival barker, promising both glory and gaffes. In 1900, he clinched a seat as the Conservative MP for Oldham, a victory sweeter than a stolen kiss. But Churchill, ever the contrarian, soon found himself at odds with his own party. Imagine a man who buys a ticket to a rock concert, only to start a debate with the band about their set list. By 1904, he'd swapped sides, joining the Liberals in a move that had his Tory colleagues clutching their pearls. His defection wasn't just a political shift. It was a full-blown metamorphosis, as if he'd decided to swap his bowler hat for a beret. The Liberals offered him something the Conservatives couldn't, a platform for his modernizing zeal, and perhaps more importantly, an opportunity to stand out from the crowd. And stand out he did. His rise was meteoric, like a firework that explodes into 1,000 colors, dazzling and impossible to ignore. Churchill's early political career was a cocktail of bold ideas and risky bets, shaken, not stirred. In 1908, he was appointed president of the Board of Trade, where he championed social reforms that were as popular as a free bar at a wedding. He pushed for labor exchanges and unemployment insurance, policies that seemed radical enough to make Victorian-era Tories spit out their tea. But despite his reformist zeal, Churchill was no saint of the working class. His policies, while progressive, often reeked of paternalism, the kind that assumes the poor need a firm hand more than a helping one. Fast forward to 1911, and Churchill was handed the keys to the Admiralty. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony. A man who had once been captured in war now in charge of the British Navy. His tenure was marked by a fervent modernization campaign. He championed the development of the dreadnoughts, massive battleships that were the naval equivalent of flexing one's muscles at a diplomatic cocktail party. He also pushed for oil over coal, a decision that made environmentalists' future selves cringe. But strategically, it was a masterstroke, prepping the fleet for the mechanized warfare that was looming on the horizon. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the fleet in the Dardanelles. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 was Churchill's brainchild, an ambitious plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of World War I by forcing a naval passage to Constantinople. It was a strategic gamble that seemed brilliant on paper, kind you want to frame and hang above your mantelpiece. But in execution, it was a disaster of epic proportions, the kind that makes you wish you'd stuck to tic-tac-toe. Gallipoli was a bloodbath, a scene so grim it could have been sketched by Hieronymus Bosch. Over 250,000 Allied casualties were recorded, a number so staggering it felt like a punch to the gut. The campaign's failure was a cocktail of poor planning, underestimation of the enemy, and sheer bad luck. It was as if the universe had conspired to teach Churchill a lesson in humility, a lesson delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Churchill, who had been so sure of his plan, found himself in the political wilderness, stripped of his post at the Admiralty and left to wander the backbenches like a disgraced monarch. It was a public humiliation so complete that it could have been scripted by Shakespeare. Yet, in true Churchillian fashion, he refused to be a mere footnote in history. Instead, he took a long, hard look at his failures and decided that the best way out was through. This period of reflection was more than just navel-gazing. It was a crucible in which his resolve was tested and tempered. He joined the army, serving on the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Scots Fusiliers. Here, amidst the mud and blood of the trenches, he regained a sense of purpose. It was a humbling experience, one that brought him closer to the men he'd once sent into battle with the stroke of a pen. It was a reminder that war was not just a game of chess, but a brutal reality lived by flesh and blood soldiers. Churchill's time in the trenches was more than just a redemption arc. It was a strategic retreat. He returned to politics in 1917, rehabilitated and ready to climb back onto the political stage, his ambitions undiminished by past failures. It was as if he decided that the only way to atone for Gallipoli was to learn from it, to turn his scars into stars that would guide him in the tumultuous years ahead. So, what do we make of this chapter in Churchill's life? a tale of ambition and hubris, of triumphs marred by catastrophic blunders. It's a reminder that even the greatest leaders are, at their core, human, prone to misjudgments and missteps. Yet, like the finest whiskey, Churchill's character was distilled through a process of trial and error, each failure adding depth to his resolve. As we leave Churchill poised for his next act, the stage is set for his eventual rise to Prime Minister. The man who once gambled with the fate of nations now held a new hand, one that would see him navigate the turbulent waters of World War II. But for now, let's pause and appreciate the paradox that was Winston Churchill, a leader forged in the fires of failure, whose relentless pursuit of greatness made him both a legend and a cautionary tale. As the storm clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, Winston Churchill was poised like a seasoned actor waiting for the curtain to rise on his most pivotal role. His history of resilience, honed through a lifetime of political theater and battlefield blunders, positioned him uniquely to step into the spotlight. It was 1940, and the world was on the brink of chaos. Britain needed a leader who could rally spirits higher than a kite on a breezy day, and who better than Winston, a man who could turn even the bleakest situation into a stirring tale of defiance. When Churchill took office as Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, Britain was staring down the barrel of a German juggernaut. The Nazis had rolled through Europe with all the subtlety of a steamroller on a flower bed. France was on the verge of collapse, and Britain's former Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had left Number 10 with more appeasement policies than actual defense strategies. It was the kind of situation that would send most people packing for a quiet life in the countryside, but not Churchill. He was like a moth to the flame of adversity. Churchill's first order of business was to address the nation, a task he approached with the gusto of an orator who knew the power of words to move mountains. His speeches were the verbal equivalent of a caffeinated energy drink, charged with phrases that would echo through history. Who could forget his pledge of blood, toil, tears, and sweat? A promise that sounded less like a political agenda and more like a grueling exercise regime. Delivered on May 13, 1940, this speech was a call to arms, a reminder that the road to victory would be paved with sacrifice. But let's debunk a myth or two while we're here, shall we? The bulldog spirit, that romanticized image of Churchill as the embodiment of British grit, was more complex than the legend suggests. Sure, he was resolute, with a growl that would make any adversary think twice. Yet, behind the scenes, Churchill's leadership style was a curious blend of brilliance and bluster. His cabinet meetings could be as chaotic as a Shakespearean farce, with Winston puffing away on his cigar, barking orders, and demanding updates at a pace that left aides spinning like tops. However, let's not gloss over the fact that Churchill wasn't a one-man army. Behind every great leader is a team of unsung heroes, a cadre of civil servants and military strategists who turned his grand visions into reality. The likes of Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Hugh Dowding, the stoic architect of the RAF's defense strategy, were just as crucial to Britain's survival as Churchill's rousing rhetoric. It was teamwork, not just tenacity, that kept Britain afloat during those dark days. Now, let's shift our gaze to Churchill's wartime strategies, which, despite their legendary status, were not without flaws. The Dunkirk evacuation of May to June 1940, often romanticized as a miracle of wartime logistics, was a testament to British resilience, but also to the failures of prior military planning. The Blitzkrieg had caught the Allies off guard, and Dunkirk was less a strategic masterstroke and more a desperate rescue mission, saving over 338,000 troops from the jaws of disaster. It was the kind of success that felt like winning a game of chess by sacrificing every piece on the board, except the king. Churchill's wartime decisions weren't always popular, even among his contemporaries. His fixation on the Mediterranean strategy, often criticized as Churchill's folly, was a prime example. While he believed that striking the soft underbelly of Europe via Italy would weaken the Axis powers, the campaign turned into a prolonged slog, consuming resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. Critics argued that this strategy was a distraction from the more pressing need to open a second front in Western Europe. Yet, it's hard to ignore the indomitable spirit that Churchill infused into the nation. His speeches were like verbal lifeboats, keeping morale afloat during the relentless Luftwaffe bombing raids known as the Blitz. From September 1940 to May 1941, London and other cities endured nightly bombardments that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. Churchill's visits to these bombed-out areas, cigar in hand and hat askew, became iconic images of leadership under fire. He was the face of defiance, the living embodiment of the phrase, "keep calm and carry on." Behind the bravado, though, was a man deeply aware of the stakes. Churchill knew that Britain's survival depended on more than just rhetoric. It required the full might of the Allied forces. His relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt was crucial, a transatlantic alliance built on mutual respect and shared goals. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, in which the U.S. provided military aid to Britain, was a lifeline that kept the British war effort from running aground on the shoals of financial ruin. As we dismantle the mythology surrounding Churchill, it's essential to recognize both the romance and reality of his leadership. He was a man of contradictions, a visionary with a penchant for risky gambles, a defender of democracy with imperialistic tendencies. Yet, it was precisely this complexity that made him the right man for the moment, a leader who could inspire hope in the face of despair, who understood that the fight against tyranny was as much a battle of wills as it was of arms. As we leave Churchill amidst the tumult and triumph of World War II, the stage is set for the next chapter in his storied career. The road to victory will be fraught with challenges, each demanding the full measure of his indomitable spirit. But for now, let's savor the paradox of Winston Churchill, a man who could turn a nation's darkest hour into its finest, a leader whose legacy, for better or worse, is as enduring as the cigars he so famously smoked. As World War II drew to a close, Winston Churchill, the indefatigable bulldog of British politics, found himself facing a new landscape as daunting as any battlefield. The war had been won, but the peace was proving to be a trickier beast to tame. Picture it: a nation battered, cities in ruins, and a populace fatigued by years of rationing and air raids. The victory bells had barely stopped ringing when Britain had to confront a stark economic reality: wartime debts as high as Big Ben, and a need to rebuild from the ground up. Churchill, ever the statesman, knew that his wartime heroics wouldn't necessarily translate into peacetime popularity. The British public, dreaming of a brighter future, wanted more than just stirring speeches. They wanted jobs, homes, and a welfare state, not just war medals and nostalgic tales of Dunkirk. And in the 1945 general election, they made their feelings clear. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, swept to power in a landslide victory, promising a new era of social reform. It was as if the Brits had decided that what they needed wasn't Churchill's bulldog tenacity, but rather a sheepdog's gentle guidance. The election result was a twist worthy of a political thriller. Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest hours, was suddenly out of office, left to wander the political wilderness once more. But before you start shedding tears into your pint, let's remember, Churchill was no stranger to setbacks. He took the defeat on the chin, although he couldn't resist a jab at Labour, quipping that they might need to employ the Gestapo to enforce their socialist policies. Ah, Winston, always the master of the backhanded compliment. Yet even in opposition, Churchill remained a towering presence on the global stage. The post-war world was a new chessboard, and Winston had a keen eye on the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, a rivalry as frosty as a Moscow winter. In a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5, 1946, Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain address. With the gravitas of a Shakespearean actor, he declared that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, warning of Soviet expansionism and the need for Western unity. It was classic Churchill, part statesman, part soothsayer, and all showman. This speech marked the beginning of his role as the de facto leader of the Western world's ideological resistance against communism. Yet behind this bravado lay a man increasingly aware of his own limitations. By the late 1940, Churchill was grappling with health issues that would have sidelined lesser men. He suffered a series of strokes, the first in 1949, which he kept secret from all but his closest aides. It was as if his own body had become a battlefield, each day a struggle against the encroaching forces of age and infirmity. Despite these challenges, Churchill's political comeback was as inevitable as a British rainy day. In the 1951 general election, the Conservatives returned to power, and Churchill was back at the helm, once again Prime Minister at the ripe age of 76. It was a victory that must have tasted sweeter than a rationed chocolate bar. But leading a post-war Britain was a different beast from wartime leadership. The country was facing economic issues that required more than just cigar-champing bravado. Churchill's second term was marked by a focus on foreign policy and the growing tensions of the Cold War. He was a vocal advocate for a united Europe, envisioning it as a bulwark against Soviet aggression. His vision was not without its critics, who saw it as contradictory to his steadfast belief in British sovereignty. But Churchill, ever the strategic thinker, understood that in a world divided into superpowers, Europe needed to unite to hold its own. His speeches on European unity were delivered with the kind of fervor that would make a rock star envious. Yet they were laced with cautionary tales of what could happen if the continent failed to stand together. Yet, as Churchill rallied for a united Europe, his domestic policies were less groundbreaking. His government struggled with the same economic challenges that had plagued the post-war era: housing shortages, inflation, and a national debt that loomed like a spectre. British economy in the early 1950s was a complex web of austerity measures and cautious optimism. Nationalization was the order of the day, with industries like coal and steel under state control, a legacy of Labour's previous government that Churchill was reluctant to dismantle entirely. The political landscape was a tightrope walk, and Churchill's health was an ever-present concern. In 1953, he suffered another stroke, this time more severe. Yet he soldiered on, refusing to let the world see him falter. It was a testament to his tenacity, but also a reminder of the toll that leadership takes on even the most robust of figures. Behind the public persona was a man acutely aware of his mortality, yet driven by a sense of duty that refused to wane. Churchill's twilight years in office were marked by a shifting public opinion. The war hero was increasingly seen as a relic of a bygone era, style and politics out of sync with the New World Order. The young lions of the Conservative Party, like Anthony Eden, were waiting in the wings, eager to take the reins. Churchill, with the wisdom of experience, knew when it was time to bow out gracefully. In April 1955, he resigned as Prime Minister, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet dignity befitting his storied career. So, what are we left with when we look at Churchill's post-war years? A man who navigated the shifting tides of global politics with the skill of an old sea captain, yet faced with the harsh reality that even legends must eventually step aside. His legacy was not just as a wartime leader, but as a symbol of resilience and tenacity, a reminder that history is as much about enduring the trials as it is about the triumphs. As we ponder the complexities of Churchill's life, both the myth and the man, it's clear that he was a figure of contradictions, a champion of liberty who wrestled with imperialist instincts, a visionary who sometimes failed to see the writing on the wall. Yet, it was this very complexity that made him a leader for the ages, a man whose story was woven into the very fabric of the 20th century. And with that, we leave Churchill poised for his final act, a man whose influence would echo through the corridors of history long after he had left the stage. As the Cold War tensions intensified and the world stood on the brink of new challenges, Churchill's legacy as a statesman, strategist, and symbol of defiance would endure, a testament to the power of leadership in times of crisis. But that, dear listener, is a story for another day. As Churchill exited the political stage, the spotlight shifted, but his larger-than-life silhouette lingered, casting a shadow long enough to stretch across decades. It was the kind of legacy that historians dream of dissecting and politicians dream of mimicking. The man who had once been the heartbeat of Britain's wartime pulse was now an emblematic figure, etched in the annals of history with the permanence of ink on parchment. But let's peel back the layers of hero worship and examine the complex tapestry of Churchill's legacy, a tapestry woven with both the golden threads of triumph and the darker strands of controversy. To millions, Churchill is the face of defiance, a symbol of stoicism in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. His speeches were like verbal fireworks that lit up the sky during the darkest days of World War II, each word a spark intended to ignite the spirit of a battered nation. Yet, behind the microphone, His leadership was a patchwork quilt of tenacity and tumult, stitched together with the kind of contradictions that could make a psychologist's head spin. He was a man who could make stirring declarations about defending democracy while simultaneously clinging to the vestiges of the British Empire like a terrier with its favorite chew toy. Churchill's policies, especially during his second stint as Prime Minister, reflect his struggle to balance the weight of history with the demands of a rapidly changing world. Post-war Britain was a nation reeling from the financial hangover of victory. The country owed a staggering debt of £21 billion, equivalent to over £700 billion today, primarily to the United States, a reminder that even the price of freedom comes with a hefty interest rate. The economic landscape was a minefield of austerity measures and rationing, a reality that made Churchill's vision of a restored Britain seem like a mirage shimmering on the horizon. Yet, despite the economic constraints, Churchill remained a staunch advocate for maintaining Britain's global influence. His push for a united Europe was not only a strategic ploy to counter Soviet expansion, but also a reflection of his belief in the power of alliances. He envisioned a United States of Europe, a precursor to the European Union, as a fortress against the ideological storm brewing in the East. But in the twisted irony of history, his vision was more prophetic than practical, as Britain itself would remain on the sidelines of European integration for decades. Now, let's not gloss over the less savory aspects of Churchill's policies, those that history buffs often sweep under the proverbial rug. His stance on colonial issues, for instance, was as outdated as a Victorian frock coat. The man who championed freedom in Europe was often blind to the cries for independence within the British Empire. His views on India, particularly during the Bengal famine of 1943, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 3 million people, reveal a leader whose priorities were as skewed as a crooked cue. Churchill's refusal to divert food supplies, coupled with his caustic remarks, painted a picture of a man trapped in the amber of his imperial convictions. Yet, to understand Churchill's enduring appeal, we must acknowledge the power of narrative in shaping historical memory. Churchill was not just a participant in history. He was its craftsman, wielding words like a sculptor's chisel. His memoirs, most notably the 6th volume, The Second World War, are less an objective account and more a masterclass in self-aggrandizement. He was a man who understood that history is often written by the victors, and in this case, the victor had a penchant for myth-making. His writings crafted a version of events that, while not entirely divorced from reality, were certainly viewed through a lens that enhanced his role from participant to protagonist. The romanticized image of Churchill as the quintessential British bulldog endures, not least because it taps into a universal desire for larger-than-life heroes. But reality often tells a more nuanced story. For every triumphant speech, there were moments of doubt and despair. For every strategic masterstroke, there were tactical blunders. Churchill's legacy, like the man himself, is a study in contrasts, a blend of foresight and folly, of wisdom and whimsy. So, what lessons can we glean from the life of Winston Churchill? Perhaps the most enduring is the power of resilience, the ability to rise from the ashes of failure like a phoenix, albeit one with a penchant for cigars and brandy. Churchill's story is a testament to the human capacity for reinvention, a reminder that setbacks are merely the prelude to comebacks. His life teaches us that leadership is as much about embracing imperfections as it is about celebrating successes. Moreover, Churchill's legacy underscores the importance of narrative in shaping our understanding of history. The tales we tell often become the truths we live by, and in this regard, Churchill was a master storyteller. His ability to craft a compelling narrative around his life and times ensured that his version of events would echo through history, cementing his place as a legendary figure, despite the complexities and contradictions of his record. As we wrap up our journey through the life of Winston Churchill, we're left with a portrait of a man whose influence transcended the boundaries of his era, a leader whose name is synonymous with steadfastness and resolve. Yet, we should also remember the man behind the legend, the flawed human being whose decisions, for better or worse, shaped the 20th century. Churchill was not just a hero of his time. He was a mirror reflecting both the aspirations and anxieties of an age. And so, dear listener, as you tuck in for a night of dreams filled with history's echoes, Remember that the story of Winston Churchill is not just a chapter in the annals of the past. It is a living narrative, a cautionary tale and an inspiring saga rolled into one. It reminds us that history is not just about the events that transpired, but about the people who dared to shape them, one speech, one decision, and one well-timed cigar at a time. In an ancient world filled with grand empires and colossal monuments, the Nabataeans were the underdogs who carved out, quite literally, a niche for themselves. Nestled in the arid landscapes of what is now modern-day Jordan, the Nabataeans turned the unforgiving desert into a bustling hub of commerce and culture. The crown jewel of their civilization, Petra, a city that was less about sand dunes and more about rock-star architecture, minus the sequined jumpsuits. Now, before you start picturing Petra as a quaint, dusty relic of the past, let's get one thing straight. This place was the ancient world's version of a high-roller suite. Think of Petra as the Las Vegas of the old world, but instead of slot machines and neon lights, you had opulent facades and intricate water systems. Sure, there were no Elvis impersonators, but who needs jailhouse rock when you've got the sound of bustling bazaars and the clatter of caravans? The Nabataeans had a knack for doing the improbable. They decided to set up shop in a place that, at first glance, looked more like a scene out of a post-apocalyptic film than a real estate paradise. We're talking about a city where location meant being smack in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rugged sandstone cliffs. But here's the kicker. Those cliffs weren't a hindrance. They were a blank canvas. The Nabataeans took chisel to stone and transformed these rocks into architectural masterpieces that would make even the pharaohs green with envy. The reason Petra was chosen as the Nabataean capital can be summed up in 2 words: prime real estate. Forget beachfront views. Back then, trade routes were the true golden ticket. Petra sat at the crossroads of several major trade routes, the ancient Silk Road of its day. It connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean and funneled precious goods like frankincense, myrrh, and spices. Imagine a bustling market where the air is thick with the scent of exotic goods, and traders haggling over prices with the enthusiasm of a Wall Street stockbroker on a caffeine high. The Nabataeans were not just savvy in geography, they were also masters of water management, a crucial skill in a region where rain was about as reliable as a Wi-Fi connection in a remote village. They constructed an elaborate system of dams, cisterns, and aqueducts to capture and channel every precious drop of water. This hydraulic wizardry not only sustained the city's population, but also allowed Petra to blossom into a lush oasis, perhaps the ancient equivalent of an eco-friendly resort. Petra's architecture was no less impressive. The Nabataeans borrowed elements from neighboring cultures, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and put their own spin on them, creating a unique architectural style that was both functional and flamboyant. The most iconic structure, of course, is Al-Khwarizmi, or the Treasury, a misnomer if there ever was one. Spoiler alert, it was never used to stash gold or jewels. Archaeologists believe it was likely a royal tomb, but the allure of hidden treasures makes for a better bedtime story, doesn't it? But let's not get too swept up in romantic notions. The reality was that life in Petra wasn't all rose-colored facades and perfumed markets. The Nabataeans had to navigate the geopolitics of their day, often playing a complex game of diplomacy with powerful neighbors like the Roman Empire. And like any thriving metropolis, Petra had its share of social stratification, with the elite living in rock-cut tombs that were the ancient version of a gated community, while the less fortunate resided in more modest abodes. The Nabataeans' talent for blending cultures extended beyond architecture. It was also evident in their religious practices. They worshipped a pantheon of deities, notably Dashara, the lord of the mountains, and Al-Azza, a goddess of fertility. Temples scattered across Petra were not just places of worship, but were also centers of communal life, where people gathered for festivals and rituals. Think of them as the city's social media platforms, where news was shared and alliances were forged. Let's not forget the broader context. The Nabataeans were trading moguls in a world where your neighbor's friend could just as easily be a business partner or a rival. Their strategic location allowed them to levy taxes on caravans passing through, filling their coffers and funding those impressive rock-carved facades. Yet, for all their wealth and innovation, the Nabataeans couldn't escape the relentless march of history. By the 2nd century AD, the Romans had annexed Nabatea, and Petra's star began to fade, overshadowed by the rising power of Rome. So, why does any of this matter today? Because the story of the Nabataeans is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. They took a barren landscape, and with a mix of grit and genius, turned it into a thriving cultural and economic powerhouse. Petra stands as a reminder that even the most inhospitable environments can be transformed by vision and determination. And perhaps, in our own way, we're all looking for a little piece of Petra, a place where we can carve out our destiny from the rock of life, no matter how tough it might seem. The Nabataeans were like the original desert magicians, conjuring water out of the bone-dry air. They weren't just building a city, they were creating an oasis in the middle of a desert, a place where one might expect to find mirages instead of thriving communities. This wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving in a place where most people wouldn't dare to pitch a tent. They turned Petra into a veritable Eden, and not the biblical kind with forbidden apples, but a real, tangible paradise with water features that would make any modern landscape architect nod in appreciation. Let's dive into the nuts and bolts, or should I say stones and channels, of their water management wizardry. The Nabataeans harnessed an intricate system of dams, cisterns, and aqueducts that were nothing short of engineering marvels. They created a network that could capture and store rainwater from the scant 150 millimeters. That's just under 6 inches for those keeping track of annual rainfall. Imagine squeezing every drop from a damp sponge in the Sahara, and you've got the idea. These systems were so sophisticated that they could redirect rainwater from the surrounding mountains into the city, like an ancient version of FedEx, but for H2O. The city was dotted with over 200 cisterns, some carved into the rock itself, each capable of holding up to 10,000 cubic meters of water. That's enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool twice over. Not only did they stash water like it was going out of style, but they also funneled rain into underground reservoirs, ensuring that Petra's citizens had a steady supply even during the driest spells. Talk about planning for a rainy day, or lack thereof. And it wasn't just about quenching thirst. Water was the lifeblood of Petra, supporting agriculture that sustained its population and fueled its economy. The Nabataeans created terraces on the hillsides for farming, using the water from their reservoirs to cultivate crops in an otherwise barren landscape. This was no small feat, considering that the nearest river, the Jordan, was a good 80 kilometers, about 50 miles away. But here's where things get even more interesting. The Nabataeans didn't just stop at basic irrigation. They turned water management into an art form. They incorporated aesthetic elements into their hydraulic systems, making water flow through the city in ways that were as pleasing to the eye as they were functional. Picture this. A city where water flowed through fountains and channels, cooling the air and creating tranquil spots for social gatherings. It's like they invented the ancient version of a luxury spa resort, complete with ambient sound effects. Of course, not everything was sunshine and refreshing breezes. The water systems that nourished Petra could also become its nemesis. The Nabataeans had to contend with flash floods, which were as unpredictable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. These sudden deluges could turn their carefully managed systems into chaotic torrents. The Nabataeans, always a step ahead, built diversion channels and flood control systems to mitigate these risks. They designed these systems to act like an ancient insurance policy, ensuring that a heavy rain didn't wash away their hard-won oasis. Now, let's talk economics for a moment. Water wasn't just a life-giving substance. It was a commodity, a currency in its own right. The Nabataeans' mastery over water allowed them to levy taxes on caravans passing through, as well as charge for the use of their water facilities. Imagine charging for access to a drinking fountain in the middle of a desert. Pure genius. This control over water resources gave the Nabataeans significant leverage in the regional economy. It was like they were running a desert-based water monopoly, and everyone else had to pay to play. But why does this matter today? Because it shows us that the Nabataeans were not just reactive to their environment, they actively transformed it. Their water management systems were a testament to human innovation and adaptability. In a world where water scarcity is becoming a pressing issue, the Nabataeans' legacy offers valuable lessons. in sustainable resource management. They remind us that with enough ingenuity, even the most inhospitable places can be transformed into thriving habitats. Nabataeans weren't just dabbling in clever plumbing. They were redefining what was possible in a desert landscape. They took the age-old adage, where there's a will, there's a way, and cranked it up to 11. Their ability to orchestrate such complex water systems without the aid of modern technology is a testament to their unparalleled ingenuity. It's a bit like watching someone build a skyscraper with nothing but toothpicks and chewing gum, and somehow it stands the test of time. So, as we marvel at the ingenuity of the Nabataeans, let's not forget the bigger picture. This wasn't just about surviving in a harsh environment. It was about creating a blueprint for future generations on how to live sustainably and harmoniously with the natural world. Petra is a reminder that with vision and determination, even the most inhospitable environments can be transformed into thriving communities. And while we may not have the Nabataeans around today to share their secrets, their legacy is etched into the very rocks of Petra, waiting to inspire new generations of innovators and dreamers. Now, speaking of legacies etched in stone, let's pivot to the economic and social gears that drove the Nabataean machine. These weren't just any old traders peddling their wares in a dusty market. Nope, the Nabataeans were more like the Wall Street wolves of antiquity, complete with the cunning and grit to match. Forget any notions of a quaint, peace-loving merchant society. These folks had business strategies sharper than their chisels. Let's break it down. Petra wasn't just a pretty face carved into rock. It was the ancient world's answer to a bustling stock exchange. The city's location was its biggest asset, sitting pretty at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. This wasn't just prime real estate. It was the equivalent of owning Boardwalk and Park Place in Monopoly. Everyone had to pass through, and the Nabataeans made sure to collect their dues. The goods that flowed through Petra were as luxurious as they were diverse. We're talking frankincense and myrrh, basically the must-have scents of the time, alongside spices, textiles, and precious metals. These commodities weren't just traded, they were taxed. And those taxes, charging, they filled Nabataean coffers faster than you can say, Silk Road. Picture a 10% levy on every caravan. It's like a toll booth that never sleeps. And for those traders who thought they could bypass Petra, well, they'd have better luck finding a mirage. But here's the kicker. The Nabataeans weren't just passive landlords collecting tolls. They were active participants in the trade game, re-exporting goods with a markup that would make any modern-day entrepreneur nod in respect. This was capitalism before capitalism knew it was capitalism. And it wasn't just about money. Power in the ancient world often came from controlling the flow of luxury goods, and the Nabataeans were as adept at this as they were at carving tombs. Now, let's not gloss over the fact that all this wealth came with its own set of challenges. The romantic notion of a peaceful society is just that, a notion. The Nabataeans had to defend their turf against rival traders and hostile neighbors. They weren't afraid to roll up their sleeves and engage in a little old-fashioned conflict if it meant protecting their interests. The reality was more Game of Thrones than a pastoral trading utopia. Of course, the trade networks didn't just bring goods and gold, they brought people. Petra wasn't just a marketplace. It was a melting pot of cultures. Imagine a vibrant tapestry woven from the threads of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Arabian, and even Indian influences. This wasn't some dusty backwater. It was a cosmopolitan hub where ideas, and sometimes spies, were exchanged as readily as spices. The cultural melange of Petra was reflected in everything from its art to its architecture, and even its language. The Nabataeans spoke a dialect of Arabic, but they wrote in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the region. This bilingualism was more than a neat party trick. It was a testament to their adaptability and openness to cultural exchange. It's like being fluent in both business jargon and the language of art, ensuring you can close a deal and appreciate the finer things in life. But let's not ignore the elephant, or should I say, camel, in the room, the social stratification. For all the talk of cultural blending, Petra was no egalitarian paradise. City had its elites, who lived in grand homes and rock-cut tombs that were the ancient equivalent of gated communities. Meanwhile, the common folk lived in more modest quarters, perhaps dreaming of a time when they too could afford to carve their mark into Petra's sandstone. Yet in this bustling hub, there was a sense of interdependence. The elites needed the craftsmen, traders, and laborers to keep the wheels turning. It was a precarious balance, held together by trade, water, and a shared stake in the city's prosperity. But like any good drama, there was always an undercurrent of tension. After all, when you're sitting on a gold mine, metaphorically speaking, everyone wants a piece of the pie. And just when you think you've got the Nabataeans all figured out, there's another twist. Their success wasn't just about savvy trading and cultural openness. It was also about knowing when to play nice with the big boys. Case in point, the Romans. The Nabataeans didn't just see Rome as a looming threat. They saw an opportunity. By playing the diplomacy card and aligning with Rome when it suited them, they managed to maintain a degree of independence even as the Roman Empire expanded. In fact, the Nabataeans were so adept at navigating these political waters that they managed to strike deals that allowed them to continue their way of life, even under Roman oversight. It was a delicate dance, but the Nabataeans were nothing if not nimble. They embraced Roman culture, even adopting Roman architecture and coinage, all while preserving their own traditions. It's a bit like wearing the latest fashion while quietly keeping your vintage wardrobe in the back of the closet, just in case. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and by the 2nd century AD, Petra's fortunes began to wane as trade routes shifted and the Romans tightened their grip. The once bustling city gradually faded from the limelight, a ghost of its former glory. But the story doesn't end there. Petra's legacy lives on, a testament to the Nabataeans' ingenuity and ambition. So, as we delve deeper into the world of the Nabataeans, let's keep our eyes on the bigger picture. This wasn't just a society of savvy traders and brilliant engineers. It was a complex web of economic, social, and political interactions that shaped an entire region. While the myths and legends offer a romanticized view of Petra, the reality was as gritty as the sandstone from which it was carved. As we continue to explore this ancient marvel, let's remember that the real story is often as intricate and layered as the rocks themselves. Now, as the Nabataeans navigated the shifting sands of geopolitics, they faced the formidable force that was Rome, a superpower that had all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop when it came to expansion. But let's not kid ourselves. The Romans weren't just interested in a friendly chat over tea. They had their eyes on Nabatea, eyeing its wealth and strategic location like a teenager staring at the last slice of pizza. So, what was Rome's game plan? Well, by the 1st century AD, the Romans began to see the Nabataean kingdom not just as a prosperous trading partner, but as a ripe target for annexation. After all, Rome had a reputation to maintain, and that reputation was built on gobbling up territories like some ancient version of Pac-Man. Nabatea, with its rich trade routes and resourceful people, was simply too tempting to resist. And here's where it gets interesting. The Nabataeans, being the shrewd operators they were, didn't just roll over and play dead. Instead, they played a deft hand of diplomacy, managing to keep things relatively peaceful with Rome for a while. They embraced Roman culture, donned togas at the occasional toga party, and even adopted Roman coinage. It was like watching a master class in blending in while still holding onto your own identity. But the Romans weren't exactly known for their patience. By AD 106, Emperor Trajan decided he'd had enough of the diplomatic niceties. He annexed Nabatea, turning it into the province of Arabia Petrea. The Nabataeans didn't put up much of a fight. Perhaps they realized that resistance was as futile as trying to stop a runaway chariot with a feather. And thus, the Nabataean kingdom was absorbed into the ever-expanding Roman Empire, like a small fish swallowed by a voracious predator. Now, let's talk about the logistics of this takeover. The Romans, never ones to do things by halves, didn't just waltz in and set up camp. They were strategic, establishing a new capital at Bostra, which was far more accessible than Petra. You see, as stunning as Petra was, it was a bit of a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to navigate those narrow canyons with an army in tow. It would have been like trying to squeeze a sumo wrestler through a keyhole. With Bostra as the new administrative hub, the Romans could exert control over the region more efficiently. They built roads that would make any modern-day civil engineer nod in approval, roads that connected the province to the larger Roman network. These weren't just dirt paths. We're talking stone-paved highways that allowed for the swift movement of troops and goods. It was the ancient equivalent of the autobahn, minus the speed limits. For the Nabataeans, This transition was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they benefited from the Pax Romana, the period of relative peace and stability that Rome enforced across its empire. Trade continued, albeit under Roman oversight, and the Nabataeans enjoyed the perks of being part of a vast economic system. On the other hand, they had to contend with Roman taxes and the loss of their political autonomy. It was a bit like being invited to a party, only to find out you're footing the bill. And what about the locals? Well, they were a resilient bunch. Some embraced Roman rule, seeing it as an opportunity for new alliances and economic opportunities. Others, however, weren't so thrilled about the new management. It was a cultural shift that required the Nabataeans to adapt or risk being left behind. They had to learn the art of Roman bureaucracy, which was as labyrinthine as the streets of Petra itself. Yet, despite these challenges, the Nabataeans didn't vanish into obscurity overnight. They continued to thrive in many ways, leveraging their skills in trade and agriculture. Their famed water management systems remained a marvel, and their artistic and architectural legacy continued to influence the region long after the Romans took over. In fact, some Nabataeans even achieved prominence within the Roman system, proving that they were nothing if not adaptable. But let's not pretend it was all roses and sunshine. The Roman annexation marked the beginning of the end for Petra as a major urban center. As trade routes shifted and political priorities changed, Petra's role as a commercial hub diminished. The city that had once been the beating heart of the Nabataean kingdom slowly faded into the background, like a once popular song that had fallen out of the charts. By the 4th century, Petra was largely abandoned, its grandeur left to the elements. Yet, even in decline, Petra retained its allure. Its rock-cut facades continued to captivate the imagination, drawing travelers and explorers who marveled at the city's enduring beauty. It was a testament to the Nabataeans' genius that, even in their absence, their legacy continued to inspire awe. So, as we ponder the decline of the Nabataeans, we must acknowledge the complex interplay of factors that led to their fall. It wasn't just the arrival of the Romans or the shifting sands of trade routes. It was a multifaceted process that reflected the broader currents of history. The Nabataeans, like many before and after them, were caught in the relentless tide of change, forced to adapt or be swept away. And yet, their story doesn't end with their decline. The Nabataeans left an indelible mark on the world, a legacy that continues to be unearthed and celebrated today. Petra stands as a symbol of their ingenuity, resilience, and vision, a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, the human spirit can carve out a legacy that endures through the ages. As we continue to explore the wonders of the Nabataean kingdom, let's remember that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of stories that connect us to our past and inspire our future. And as we stand atop the remnants of Petra, squinting through the desert haze at the legacy of the Nabataeans, it's time to sift through the sands of history and see what treasures we can uncover. Ah, the Nabataeans, a people who could turn a barren landscape into a bustling epicenter of trade and culture. But what's their secret sauce? The thing that ensures their name echoes through history halls long after their empire crumbled like ancient sandstone under the weight of time. For starters, let's talk architecture. Hollywood loves a good mystery, and Petra's Al-Khwarizmi, or the Treasury, has been cast as the star in many a silver screen adventure. Spoiler alert, it's a tomb, not a treasure vault filled with cursed gold and ancient booby traps. Granted, the real history might not have the same cinematic punch, but it's a testament to human creativity, blending Hellenistic facades with Near Eastern flair. The Nabataeans were like the original mash-up artists, remixing architectural styles before it was cool. Their knack for blending cultural influences wasn't just about aesthetics, it was also a political statement. By integrating Greek, Roman, and Egyptian elements into their architecture, the Nabataeans were saying, "Hey, we're part of the club." It was a diplomatic dance that allowed them to play nice with powerful neighbors, all while crafting a unique identity. Petra became a canvas for cultural expression, where every column told a story of trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Then there's the water management system, a subject that, believe it or not, could send a modern-day engineer scrambling for a notepad. The Nabataeans were the desert's Houdinis, conjuring water from mere whispers of rain, ensuring Petra's survival amidst the arid wilderness. Their intricate network of channels and cisterns not only supported agriculture, but also turned Petra into a green oasis. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving in a place where most would see only desolation. In a world increasingly concerned with water scarcity, the Nabataeans' hydraulic ingenuity offers lessons as relevant now as they were 2 millennia ago. Economically, the Nabataeans were the Jeff Bezoses of their time, turning trade routes into gold mines. Petra sat on the crossroads of several lucrative trade routes, and the Nabataeans milked that location for all it was worth. They were middlemen extraordinaire, taxing caravans and trading goods like frankincense and myrrh, the ancient world's version of Chanel No. 5. Their strategic positioning allowed them to wield economic power far beyond their numbers, proving that sometimes it's not how big your army is, but where you plant your flag. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the Nabataeans as benevolent rulers of a rich trade empire. Beneath the romantic veneer lay a society rife with social stratification. The elite lived in rock-cut mansions, while the less fortunate were left to scuttle about in simpler dwellings. It's a reminder that even in a city carved from stone, social hierarchies are as entrenched as ever. Petra was as much about navigating class dynamics as it was about navigating trade routes. And then there's the matter of their eventual decline, a story with as many twists and turns as the canyons leading into Petra. The Nabataeans were finally subsumed into the Roman Empire, a fate that sometimes feels as inevitable as gravity. The Romans were like the black hole of ancient civilizations, pulling in anything within reach. Yet, even as Petra faded from prominence, it left behind a legacy that refused to be forgotten, much like a classic hit that's been sampled by every new generation of artists. So, what keeps us coming back to Petra? Is it the allure of long-lost treasure troves, the romantic idea of a city hidden from time, waiting to be rediscovered? Or is it something deeper? Perhaps it's the realization that, in their rise and fall, the Nabataeans mirror the broader human narrative, a testament to our capacity for innovation and adaptation, as well as our tendency to be swept away by the tides of history. The Nabataeans teach us that the beauty of a civilization lies not just in its monuments, but in the ingenuity and resilience of its people. They remind us that even in the harshest of environments, human creativity can carve out wonders from the barest stone. And while Petra may have been lost to time for centuries, its rediscovery serves as a reminder that history is never truly gone. It's just waiting for someone to dust off the sand and bring its stories back to life. So next time you find yourself wandering the ruins of Petra, take a moment to appreciate not just the grandeur, but the grit that built it. Picture the bustling marketplaces, the strategic negotiations, and yes, even the social tensions that pulsed through this ancient city. Because at the end of the day, the Nabataeans weren't just building a city in the desert. They were creating a legacy that would echo through the ages, inspiring dreamers and doers for generations to come. In the year 69 BC, the sands of Egypt weren't just blowing around aimlessly. They were swirling with enough political chaos to rival any modern-day soap opera. Cleopatra Roman 7, that formidable last pharaoh of Egypt, was born right into this mess, a time when Egypt was less a picturesque postcard and more a political pressure cooker. Forget the romanticized visions of Cleopatra lounging around in opulent palaces. Her early years were more about surviving the cutthroat world of Ptolemaic power struggles. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra's rather dysfunctional family, had a unique approach to governance. Their favorite pastime, sibling rivalry, with a side of attempted murder. Succession disputes weren't just family squabbles, they were blood sport. If you thought your family gatherings were awkward, try sitting down to dinner with relatives who might literally be plotting your demise. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Roman 12, also known by the not-so-flattering nickname Orleats, which translates to the flutist, was more interested in his music than in ruling. He was rumored to have a penchant for playing the flute poorly, and if that wasn't enough to unsettle the court, his reign was marked by rampant corruption and a bit of Roman bootlicking. Egypt, at this time, was like a wealthy but debt-ridden bachelor trying to avoid bankruptcy. The country's economy was a paradox of opulence and insolvency. While Egypt was rich in resources, particularly grain, which was akin to the oil of the ancient world, Ptolemy Roman 12 managed to rack up a debt to Rome that would make a modern credit card company blush. He borrowed heavily from Roman moneylenders to secure his throne, increasing Egypt's financial woes while essentially handing over the country's sovereignty on a silver platter. Cleopatra, growing up amidst this fiscal fiasco, learned early on that charming the Romans was as crucial as charming her own people. Now, let's debunk a myth. Cleopatra's influence was not just about her legendary beauty. In fact, contemporary Roman sources like Plutarch describe her beauty as not altogether incomparable. That's ancient historian speak for she's all right, I guess. What really set Cleopatra apart was her intellect and charisma. She was as sharp as an obsidian blade and spoke as many as 9 languages. This linguistic prowess allowed her to communicate directly with diplomats and scholars without relying on translators. Her education wasn't just a footnote. It was a power move in a world where knowledge was closely guarded. Politically, Cleopatra was a master of survival in a family where trust was as scarce as water in the Sahara. Her ascent to the throne wasn't a straight path. It was a strategic climb over rivals, including her own siblings. The family drama reached new heights when Ptolemy Roman XII died, leaving the throne to Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy Roman XIII. Sharing power was about as comfortable for them as sharing a bed with a crocodile. The two were supposed to rule jointly, but Cleopatra, never one to be overshadowed, was clearly the brains of the operation. As Cleopatra maneuvered through this treacherous political landscape, she was acutely aware of Egypt's precarious position on the global stage. Rome was the big kid on the block, and Egypt was the rich nerd with a target on its back. The Romans had their eyes on Egypt's wealth, and Cleopatra knew that maintaining Egypt's independence required a delicate dance with Roman interests. Her understanding of this geopolitical reality was not just savvy. It was essential for her survival and the survival of her kingdom. In essence, Cleopatra's early life was like a masterclass in crisis management. She learned to navigate a world where alliances were as fleeting as the Nile's floodwaters, and where power was the ultimate currency. Her journey from a young girl in a turbulent court to the queen who would capture the imagination of empires was not just about personal ambition. It was about the survival of her people, her culture, and her legacy. Cleopatra's rise to power was a testament to her resilience and strategic brilliance, not just her allure. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Cleopatra's reign would be marked by more than just alliances and ambitions. It would be a saga of survival against the odds. Let's pick up where we left off. Cleopatra's ascent to the throne was like playing a high-stakes game of chess, with every move calculated for survival. But when your opponent is your own brother, and the stakes include a throne and the fate of a nation, it's more like chess with dynamite. Her co-ruler and baby brother, Ptolemy Roman XIII, wasn't content with sharing power, and things got as fiery as the Egyptian sun. By 49 BC, Cleopatra found herself ousted and exiled, thanks to Ptolemy's regents. A minor setback for most, perhaps, but Cleopatra wasn't most rulers. Enter Julius Caesar, stage left. Now, if you think Cleopatra's legendary roll-up in a rug to meet Caesar is just Hollywood fiction, think again. This was no mere party trick. It was a masterstroke of political theater. Cleopatra knew that first impressions mattered, especially when dealing with someone as influential as Caesar. She wasn't just meeting a Roman general. She was meeting the Roman general. The stakes were higher than the pyramids. Cleopatra's arrival wrapped in a rug was both dramatic and practical. After all, sneaking into enemy territory disguised as a common delivery was safer than waltzing through the front door. This bold move was designed to leave an impression, and boy, did it work. Caesar, no stranger to spectacle himself, was taken with Cleopatra's audacity and intelligence. Let's not kid ourselves here. Caesar's interest wasn't purely political. Cleopatra was a queen, and aligning with her offered Caesar substantial political leverage. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, saw in Caesar a chance to reclaim her throne. Their alliance wasn't just a cozy romance, it was a calculated power play. Cleopatra knew that restoring her position required more than persuasion. It demanded Roman muscle, and Caesar was more than willing to flex it. Economically, this alliance was a godsend for Egypt. The country was like a treasure trove that had been left to gather dust. By aligning with Caesar, Cleopatra wasn't just securing her throne. She was ensuring the continued flow of Roman protection for Egypt's wealth. And let's be clear, Egypt's wealth was substantial. We're talking about a grain production that fed Rome, and let's not forget the luxury goods that made Roman elites swoon. This wasn't a minor alliance. This was a merger of giants. The battle that followed, the siege of Alexandria, was less a duel between siblings and more of a Roman intervention. Caesar's forces clashed with those of Ptolemy Roman 13, and let's just say the outcome was as predictable as a Roman toga party getting out of hand. Ptolemy Roman 13, not quite living up to his numerical predecessor, met his end in the Nile. Cleopatra was back on the throne, with her little brother Ptolemy Roman 14 as a nominal co-ruler. But let's be honest, Cleopatra was the one calling the shots. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar wasn't all politics, though their union produced a son, Ptolemy Roman 15, adorably nicknamed Caesarion, which translates to Little Caesar. No, he wasn't peddling pizzas, but he did represent a potential future alliance between Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra's vision extended beyond her immediate rule. She was thinking dynastically. This was her opening gambit in a long game of thrones. Meanwhile, the economic landscape of Egypt under Cleopatra was undergoing a transformation. The queen knew that to maintain her power, she needed to bolster Egypt's economy. This wasn't a time for fiscal frivolity. It was about financial fortitude. Cleopatra implemented policies to stabilize the economy, ensuring that Egypt's wealth wasn't just a myth, but a reality. While Ptolemy Roman 12 reign had been characterized by debt and dependence, Cleopatra was determined to restore Egypt's economic sovereignty. However, this wasn't just about economics. It was about perception. Cleopatra's reign was as much about managing narratives as it was about managing resources. She cultivated an image of prosperity, one that would appeal to her Roman allies and intimidate her enemies. Her court became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars and philosophers from across the known world. This wasn't just for show. It was a demonstration of Egypt's enduring legacy and influence. In crafting her legendary image, Cleopatra understood the power of myths. She wasn't just a queen, she was Isis incarnate, a goddess among mortals. This wasn't just a vanity project, it was a strategic maneuver. By aligning herself with divine imagery, Cleopatra reinforced her legitimacy and authority. To her subjects, she wasn't just a ruler, she was a divine protector, a living symbol of Egypt's glory. But let's not romanticize too much. Cleopatra's reign wasn't a walk down the Nile. It was a constant battle to maintain power and navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Her alliance with Caesar was just the beginning. With his assassination in 44 BC, the political landscape shifted once again. Cleopatra found herself in a precarious position, needing to secure new alliances to protect Egypt's interests. As we pause here, remember that Cleopatra's story is a saga of resilience, strategic brilliance, and a touch of theatrical flair. Her journey wasn't just about survival. It was about crafting a legacy that would echo through history. But don't get too comfortable. There's more drama to come. Stay tuned as we unravel how Cleopatra navigated the turbulent tides of Roman politics post-Caesar, and how her alliances continue to shape the destiny of her kingdom, with Caesar's assassination playing out like a Shakespearean tragedy. Long before the bard even put quill to parchment, Cleopatra found the ground shifting beneath her feet. Rome was turning into a political tinderbox, and Cleopatra, ever the master of adaptation, needed to navigate these choppy waters with the finesse of a Nile crocodile on the hunt. Her ability to read the room, whether it was a Roman senate or her own court, was about to be tested more than ever. Enter Mark Antony, stage right, a Roman general known for his military prowess, political acumen, and let's face it, a flair for the dramatic that could rival Cleopatra's own. Their meeting wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a full-blown collision of powerhouses. Antony was part of the Second Triumvirate, Rome's latest power-sharing experiment, and Cleopatra saw in him both an ally and a protector for Egypt. This was more than just a romantic entanglement. It was Cleopatra's strategic lifeline in a sea of Roman chaos. Cleopatra's role as a ruler was multifaceted, and her administrative reforms were nothing short of revolutionary for the time. Let's start with her economic policies. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth was its lifeblood, and she wasn't about to let it trickle away like the sand through an hourglass. She implemented tax reforms to ensure the treasury was as full as the granaries. These policies weren't just about filling the coffers. They were about asserting control over a realm that had been as financially unstable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Her visionary projects were equally grand. Take the Library of Alexandria, for example. Considered the crowning jewel of the ancient world's intellectual capital, it had suffered due to neglect and previous conflicts. Cleopatra's efforts to rebuild and revitalize it weren't just about bricks and scrolls. They were about asserting Egypt as a beacon of knowledge and culture. This was Cleopatra's way of saying, we're not just about pyramids and pharaohs, we're about preserving the intellectual treasures of humanity. Of course, balancing these grand ambitions with the practicalities of ruling wasn't without its challenges. Cleopatra had to appeal to both Egyptian and Roman sensibilities, a delicate balancing act akin to juggling cobras. To her Egyptian subjects, Cleopatra was the living embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess. Her divine status wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a necessity to maintain her legitimacy in the eyes of a populace that looked up to the gods as much as they did their rulers. On the Roman front, Cleopatra had to play the role of the savvy diplomat. She knew that a lavish court could keep Roman dignitaries dazzled and distracted. Her court was a spectacle of opulence with banquets that could make even the most decadent Roman senator gasp. But maintaining such extravagance came with a price tag that would make a modern billionaire wince. Cleopatra understood that keeping the Romans happy was an investment in Egypt's security, and she spent accordingly. Yet, the costs of maintaining such a court were astronomical. It's estimated that Cleopatra's court consumed resources that could have sustained entire provinces. But Cleopatra wasn't just burning through the budget for fun. She was making a statement. In the world of ancient politics, appearances were everything, and Cleopatra knew how to put on a show. Her palace wasn't just a residence. It was a stage where she played the role of queen, goddess, and diplomat all at once. As for the myth of Cleopatra's beauty being her only asset, let's lay that to rest once and for all. While Roman propaganda painted her as a seductress, the reality was much more nuanced. Cleopatra's allure was in her intellect and ability to command attention in any room she entered. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was a linguistic genius, a political strategist, and a cultural patron all rolled into one. Her charm was a tool, not a crutch, and she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Meanwhile, Antony and Cleopatra's partnership wasn't just a headline-grabbing romance. They had legitimate political goals. For Antony, Cleopatra offered access to Egypt's resources and wealth, essential for his campaigns and ambitions in the East. For Cleopatra, Antony was a shield against Rome's ever-looming shadow. Their union was as much about power as it was about passion, a dual-purpose alliance in a world where both were in short supply. Their relationship also had tangible economic benefits. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain, was a crucial component of Antony's military campaigns. Cleopatra's support wasn't just a token gesture. It was a strategic move to ensure that Antony remained a potent force in Roman politics. This wasn't merely about personal gain. It was about securing Egypt's future in a world increasingly dominated by Roman interests. In all this, Cleopatra was acutely aware of the narratives being spun around her. The Romans, masters of propaganda, often depicted her as a foreign temptress leading Antony astray. But Cleopatra knew the power of image and crafted her own narrative to counter these claims. She portrayed herself not just as a ruler, but as a custodian of Egypt's legacy and a key player on the global stage. Her story was one of survival, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of power, not just for herself, but for her people. As we pause here, remember, Cleopatra's reign wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a chapter of audacity and ambition. Her story is far from over, and as we delve deeper into her alliances and maneuvers, we'll uncover how she continued to shape the fate of Egypt amidst the swirling tides of Roman politics. Stay tuned for more intrigue and strategy as Cleopatra's saga unfolds, proving that her legacy is as enduring as the pyramids themselves. As Cleopatra's story unfurls, let's dive into her partnership with Mark Antony, a relationship historically over-romanticized to the point of resembling a Hollywood blockbuster. But beneath the glitz is a strategic alliance as calculated as a chess grandmaster's in-game. Antony wasn't just Cleopatra's paramour. He was a key ally in her quest to maintain Egypt's autonomy amid Rome's encroaching shadow. Picture this. It's 41 BC. Cleopatra and Antony meet in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, where Cleopatra allegedly made her grand entrance on a golden barge adorned with purple sails, a spectacle designed to put the askers' red carpet to shame. But this wasn't just Cleopatra showing off a yacht collection. It was a deliberate power play. Antony, known for his own love of the theatrical, was captivated, but Cleopatra wasn't there to flirt. She was there to negotiate. Antony's political and military clout was immense. As a member of the Second Triumvirate, he wielded considerable influence, and Cleopatra saw in him not just an ally, but a means to secure her throne and Egypt's future. For Antony, Cleopatra wasn't merely an exotic distraction. She was the key to the grain-rich lands of Egypt, a critical asset for feeding Rome's ever-hungry populace and army. The pairing of these two titans was less a romance novel and more a merger of dynastic ambition. From their union sprang not just lavish banquets and opulent celebrations, but also a brood of children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene in 40 BC, followed by Ptolemy Philadelphus in 36 BC. These children weren't just the product of a love affair. They were strategic heirs, cementing the alliance between Egypt and Rome. Cleopatra was playing the long game, thinking dynastically, even as Rome was in the throes of civil unrest. Now, let's talk economics. Cleopatra's Egypt was like a well-oiled machine, with its economy primarily driven by agriculture. The Nile Delta was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and Cleopatra's control over this vital resource gave her significant leverage. This wasn't just about securing a comfortable lifestyle. It was about geopolitical power. Rome needed Egypt's grain, and Cleopatra knew it. Antony's military campaigns, especially his ambitions in Parthia, required resources, and Egypt was the jackpot. However, love and politics are seldom a smooth sail. By 36 BC, Antony's Parthian campaign was a disaster, with troop losses that would make any general weep. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatic ruler, provided supplies and reinforcements, but the campaign left Antony's reputation tarnished, his power base in Rome shaky. Cleopatra's support wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a calculated investment in a partner who was now politically vulnerable. Fast forward to 31 BC, and we're on the brink of one of history's most famous naval battles, Actium. This wasn't just a clash of ships. It was a showdown between Antony and Octavian, the future Augustus, Rome's rising star. Cleopatra's fleet was no small affair. She commanded a navy of more than 60 ships, a testament to her maritime prowess and strategic importance. But let's debunk a myth. Cleopatra didn't seduce Antony into an ill-advised campaign. The decision to face Octavian at sea was born out of necessity and desperation, not pillow talk. The Battle of Actium was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra, a tactical nightmare that ended in their retreat. While romantic tales paint Cleopatra as fleeing the battle in a fit of cowardice, the truth is far more strategic. She recognized the battle was lost and made a tactical withdrawal to preserve what remained of her forces. This wasn't a betrayal. It was a survival instinct honed by years of political maneuvering. Post-Actium, the decline was swift. Antony's forces crumbled, and he returned to Egypt defeated, his alliance with Cleopatra now a liability rather than an asset. Economically, the defeat strained Egypt's coffers, which had supported Antony's ambitions for years. Cleopatra's once thriving economy was now burdened by the costs of war and the looming threat of Roman annexation. In the aftermath, Cleopatra's focus shifted to securing a future for her children. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, offering treasure and alliances to protect her dynasty. Cleopatra was no damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She was a queen fighting tooth and nail to preserve her legacy. But Rome, hungry for power and wary of Cleopatra's influence, wasn't interested in negotiation. As Cleopatra's tale winds toward its dramatic conclusion, let's remember that her story is one of ambition, strategy, and survival against overwhelming odds. Her partnership with Antony was more than a love story. It was a political alliance steeped in realpolitik and the harsh realities of power. Cleopatra's legacy isn't just the stuff of legend. It's a testament to the enduring struggle for control, identity, and influence in a world dominated by larger-than-life figures and empires. Stay tuned, because Cleopatra's saga is far from over. As we delve deeper into the aftermath of Actium and the final chapters of her reign, we'll uncover how her legacy continued to shape the course of history long after her death. The rise and fall of Cleopatra is a tale as enduring as the sands of Egypt, a story of power, passion, and the relentless pursuit of a legacy that would echo through the ages. And so here we are, standing on the precipice of Cleopatra's final act, a drama that would make even the likes of Shakespeare sit up and take notes. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, was now facing the ultimate checkmate. With Antony's forces decimated and Octavian's armies marching ever closer, the Queen of the Nile was in a bind tighter than an ancient Egyptian mummy. But Cleopatra wasn't one to go quietly into history's night. She had one last, desperate gambit up her sleeve, a negotiation with Octavian himself. Cleopatra knew what was at stake. The Roman annexation of Egypt would not only strip her of her crown, but potentially erase the legacy she fought so fiercely to preserve. She attempted to sway Octavian with promises of wealth and cooperation, but the future Augustus, as calculating as Cleopatra herself, saw the political advantages of parading her defeat back in Rome. Octavian wasn't in the market for allies. He was out to solidify his own power, and Cleopatra's allure couldn't compete with the spoils of her downfall. Still, Cleopatra was determined to write her own ending. The queen who had once unfurled herself from a rug to meet Caesar now planned her exit with the same theatrical flair. On August 10, 30 BC, Cleopatra was found dead in her mausoleum, an asp, the ancient symbol of royalty, allegedly delivering the lethal bite. Now, let's pause and debunk this serpentine tale. The idea of Cleopatra choosing death by snake is as dramatic as it is unlikely. More plausible theories suggest poison, self-administered. Either way, Cleopatra chose a death on her terms, a final act of defiance against the inevitability of Roman conquest. Antony, upon hearing of Cleopatra's demise, took his own life, leaving Octavian to sweep into Alexandria unopposed. With Cleopatra's death, the last vestiges of Egyptian independence crumbled like a temple in a sandstorm. Octavian annexed Egypt, transforming it into a Roman province, and effectively ending 3,000 years of pharaohs. The economy, once the envy of the Mediterranean, was now a cog in the Roman machine, its abundant grain supply fueling Rome's expansionist ambitions. Cleopatra's children, the living chess pieces of her dynastic aspirations, were scattered. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was executed. Octavian had no need for pretenders to complicate his rule. The others were spared, raised in Rome, their Egyptian heritage buried under Roman tutelage. The queen's legacy, however, was far from obliterated. If anything, it grew in the telling. Over the centuries, Cleopatra's story was spun into a tapestry of romance and tragedy. Roman historians, eager to paint Octavian, now Augustus, as the savior of the Roman Republic, cast Cleopatra as the exotic temptress who ensnared Roman men with her wiles. The reality was far less flattering. Cleopatra was a shrewd politician, a ruler who leveraged what she had, brains over beauty, to keep her nation afloat in turbulent times. Her concrete achievements, though overshadowed by her dramatic end, were significant. Cleopatra revitalized the economy, stabilized currency, and expanded Alexandria's cultural influence. She turned her court into a hub of learning, attracting intellectuals from all over the ancient world. Her leadership was less about seduction and more about survival, a balancing act between maintaining Egypt's sovereignty and navigating Rome's imperial ambitions. Fast forward to today, and Cleopatra's legacy remains a potent cocktail of myth and reality. While Hollywood continues to churn out versions of her story, usually focusing on her love life more than her leadership, historians strive to peel back the layers of romantic embellishment. Cleopatra's story is a reminder of how history often picks favorites. She was a woman who wielded power in a man's world, a ruler who dared to play the imperial game with Rome and almost won. Her legacy is palpable in both the romanticized tales that captivate the public imagination and the historical records that highlight her political acumen. Cleopatra wasn't just a footnote in Rome's imperial narrative. She was a key player who influenced the course of an empire. Her life and reign illustrate the often overlooked complexities of female leadership in ancient times. defying simplistic caricatures of queens as mere ornaments to power. In the end, Cleopatra's story is a paradox, a tale of power and vulnerability, ambition and demise. Her life was the ancient world's equivalent of a high-stakes drama, full of intrigue, passion, and a relentless pursuit of legacy. And while her dynasty may have crumbled beneath the march of Roman legions, her story endures, echoing through history like the enduring monuments of the Egypt she fiercely loved until her last breath. Cleopatra's tale is a testament to the power of narrative, of how history remembers those who dared to defy the odds, and how legends are born in the space between fact and fiction. The world didn't exactly roll out a red carpet for Confucius. If destiny had a welcoming committee, it must have been on a lunch break when he popped into existence in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, smack dab in what we now know as Shandong Province, China. The budding philosopher was born into a humble family, the kind that knew more about frugality than philosophy, and had fewer yuan to rub together than a monk in a vow of poverty. His father, Xu Lianghe, had the rather unglamorous job of being a military officer, but not the kind that barks orders from an ornate chariot, more like the kind who marches alongside the foot soldiers, probably grumbling about the sorry state of his sandals. Confucius' family was not exactly swimming in silk robes or feasting on peacock tongues. No, this was the socio-economic backdrop of the Zhou dynasty, a time when the glittering facade of ancient Chinese civilization often overshadowed the gritty reality beneath. The dynasty itself was kind of like a once great rock band that had seen better days. It started with a bang around 1046 BCE, but by Confucius' time, it was well into its emo phase, plagued by internal strife and regional power struggles that would make a Game of Thrones season look like a family picnic. According to legend, a delightful bit that's more fairy tale than fact, Confucius was born in a cave. Now, I know what you're thinking. Was his mother a proto-hipster seeking natural birthing methods? Hardly. The legend claims his mother, Yan Zhengzai, had a dream about a mystical creature, the Kai Lin, kind of like a unicorn but with a more dragon-y vibe, announcing her son's birth. But let's not kid ourselves. The cave story is more likely an ancient PR spin than a historical account. In reality, Confucius' family likely lived in conditions that would make the word modest sound like an overstatement. Despite the less-than-lavish beginnings, Confucius' early life was far from dull. His father died when Confucius was just 3, leaving his mother to raise him in an environment where the only thing more common than hard work was the struggle to find it. It was a classic rags-to-riches tale minus the riches. But what Yan Zhengzai lacked in resources, she made up for in grit and determination, qualities that would rub off on her son like dirt on a street urchin's face. Confucius was an inquisitive kid, the kind who'd probably ask why the sky was blue until everyone around him needed a nap. Unfortunately, formal education wasn't exactly a budget-friendly option for his family. Schooling back then wasn't a right. It was a privilege, often reserved for those whose family trees had more branches than a bonsai. So, Confucius did what any resourceful kid would do. He learned from life itself, and when possible, from the occasional mentor willing to indulge his endless questions. The Zhou dynasty's socio-political climate was a real plot twist. What started as a unified kingdom had turned into a patchwork quilt of warring states, with rulers who seemed to think diplomacy was code for let's conquer our neighbors. This constant turmoil created an environment where the search for ethical and effective governance became not just a philosophical exercise, but a survival strategy. And right in the middle of this maelstrom was the young Confucius, absorbing societal chaos like a sponge in a rainstorm. Despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, Confucius developed an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He wasn't content with just knowing things. He wanted to understand them. This curiosity led him to become an autodidact, a word that here means, I'll learn it myself, thank you very much. And he immersed himself in the teachings of the Zhou classics. Think of him as the ancient equivalent of a bookworm, minus the e-reader and plus a lot more scrolls. But before he could become the sage we all know and quote at dinner parties to sound profound, he had to navigate the world of work. His first job was as a keeper of the granaries. Not exactly a glamorous gig, but hey, you've got to start somewhere, right? Handling grain might not seem like the ideal training ground for a philosopher, but it taught him the value of diligence and organization, traits he would later apply to his teachings. So here was Confucius, a young man with a keen intellect and a burning desire for stability in a world that seemed allergic to it. He was living proof that you don't need royal blood to change the world, just a relentless determination and a knack for asking the right questions. His early years were a testament to the power of perseverance, an essential ingredient for anyone hoping to leave a mark on history. In the end, Confucius' early life was a blend of myth and reality, a cocktail of hardship and hope that would shape him into the thinker who would forever alter the philosophical landscape of China. Whether he was born in a cave or not, one thing's for sure: his ideas were destined to leave the confines of his humble beginnings and echo through the ages. And that, my friends, is the real magic of Confucius. And speaking of magic, let's talk about the disappearing act Confucius pulled when he entered the political arena. You see, the young sage had his eyes set on transforming society from the inside out. He figured, why not give politics a whirl? Spoiler alert, this was more a roundabout than a whirlwind romance. Confucius snagged himself a job as a low-level government official in the state of Lu, around the mid-500s BCE. Picture him, not quite in the halls of power, more like the broom closet adjacent. His official role was as a minor magistrate, dealing with mundane stuff like livestock and markets. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of being a weekend mall cop. But for Confucius, this was a stepping stone to greater things, or so he thought. In a world where corruption was less a bug and more a feature, Confucius quickly realized that his high-minded ideals were about as welcome as a philosopher at a frat party. The political landscape was a mess, a patchwork of alliances and backstabbing that wouldn't have looked out of place in a soap opera. Confucius, with his penchant for order and ethics, was like a fish out of water, or more accurately, a fish in a shark tank. He lasted in politics about as long as a New Year's resolution. After a few years, he decided he'd had enough. Disillusioned with the political circus, Confucius took a hard left turn and embraced teaching. He was like, if you can't change the system, change the people who run it. So he hung up his official robes and picked up the chalk, or whatever the ancient equivalent was, bamboo slip and brush, maybe. Now, about this legend of Confucius having 1,000 students. It sounds impressive, doesn't it? Like he was the original rock star of education with groupies in every province. The reality? Probably less stadium tour, more intimate garage sessions. While he did have a loyal following, we're talking about a few dozen devoted students at most. Enrollment in Confucius Academy didn't hit quadruple digits, but it did attract some of the most influential minds of the time. Confucius was less about stuffing heads with facts and more about sculpting character. His teaching method was revolutionary, kind of like Socratic dialogue, but with more Confucian seasoning. He emphasized moral integrity, proper conduct, and the importance of ritual, not because he was a stickler for tradition, but because he saw these as the building blocks of a stable society. Think of his classes as part philosophy seminar, part self-improvement workshop. He wasn't just reading from a scroll. He was challenging his students to think critically, question assumptions, and heaven forbid, use their brains. This was radical stuff in an era when rote memorization was the educational gold standard. Confucius didn't just want to fill minds. He wanted to light them up like a fireworks display on New Year's Eve. But let's not romanticize the whole affair too much. It wasn't all enlightenment and epiphanies. Being a student of Confucius meant hard work, late nights, and probably a few existential crises thrown in for good measure. His teachings weren't just lectures on ethics. They were life lessons that demanded introspection and discipline. You had to be the kind of person who'd stick with a puzzle until all the pieces fit, even if you had to turn the table over to do it. So, while the myth of Confucius and his 1,000 students paints a picture of an ancient intellectual superstar, the reality was a bit more grounded. He was a teacher who valued quality over quantity, one who believed that even a few good students could change the world. And in that sense, maybe the legend isn't so far from the truth after all. Confucius' shift from a bureaucratic dead end to an educational pioneer wasn't just a career change. It was a legacy in the making. By stepping away from the political chaos and focusing on teaching, he planted the seeds for a philosophical movement that would echo through Chinese history like a gong in a quiet temple. His early career may have been short-lived, but his impact on the world of ideas, that was just getting started. In the end, Confucius' journey from government official to revered teacher was a testament to the power of perseverance and vision. He saw the cracks in the political system and chose to build something new, one student at a time. And while his political career was a blip, his teachings were the main event, setting the stage for a philosophical legacy that would outlast empires. But don't get too cozy in this tale of transformation just yet. Confucius' journey was far from over, and the road ahead was paved with both triumphs and trials. Stay tuned, because as the sage once said, "Okay, not really, but it sounds like something he might have said. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single scroll." Now, as Confucius embarked on this journey of 1,000 scrolls, it's time to unfold the scroll itself, his philosophy. Let's dive into the intellectual cauldron of ideas he stirred, starting with Ren and Lai. Imagine these two as the philosophical dynamic duo of ancient China, not Batman and Robin, but pretty close in terms of importance. First up, Ren. This is the big one, the headliner in Confucius' philosophical concert. Ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, was Confucius' holy grail. He saw it as the ultimate virtue, the moral fiber that kept the fabric of society from unraveling. For Confucius, Ren wasn't just about being nice to your neighbor or refraining from flipping the chariot bird when someone cut you off on the dirt road. It was deeper, a call to cultivate empathy and compassion, not just for your kin, but for humanity writ large. A tall order in a world where survival often trumped sentiment. Picture this. Confucius believed that if everyone embraced Ren, society would be as harmonious as a well-rehearsed orchestra. But this wasn't some pie-in-the-sky idealism. He knew that in the dog-eat-dog world of the warring states, talking about universal love was like bringing a salad to a barbecue, noble but unlikely to catch on. So he started small, teaching his students to practice Ren in their daily interactions, hoping the ripple effect would eventually lead to a tide of social change. Then we have Lai, which often gets translated as ritual propriety. Now, before you roll your eyes at the thought of ancient etiquette lessons, hear me out. Lai wasn't just about bowing at the right angle or knowing which spoon to use for soup. For Confucius, Lai was the societal glue, the set of rituals and norms that kept chaos at bay. It was about showing respect, not just to others, but to the traditions that shaped one's culture and identity. Imagine it as the original social contract, a way to ensure everyone played nice, and the kingdom didn't descend into anarchy. Confucius was convinced that a society that practiced Lai was like a well-oiled machine, each cog turning in harmony with the rest. He argued that rituals were more than mindless routines. They were expressions of a deeper social order. In a time when warlords were more common than peace treaties, and political alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm, Lai was Confucius' way of bringing some much-needed order to the chaos. But let's not kid ourselves about Confucius being some kind of ancient superhuman sage with answers to all of life's questions. The myth of his boundless wisdom makes for a great story, but the reality, as always, is messier. Confucius was a man of his time, grappling with the same uncertainties and frustrations as everyone else. He didn't have a smartphone to Google the meaning of life, so he did what any self-respecting philosopher would do. He thought deeply, taught passionately, and hoped that his ideas would outlast the next regime change. Confucius' quest to revive a golden age was akin to trying to bring back a favorite TV show after a disastrous final season. The Western Zhou period, which he idealized, was long gone, and the world around him was as stable as a three-legged table. Yet he believed in the possibility of returning to those halcyon days of virtue and order, despite the political landscape resembling more of a battlefield than a philosopher's paradise. His role as a reformer was fraught with challenges. Confucius was like the ultimate social justice warrior of his time, minus the hashtags and viral tweets. He roamed from state to state, spreading his teachings and trying to convince rulers that moral governance was worth more than a treasury full of gold. Yet, his ideas often fell on deaf ears, as leaders were more interested in expanding their kingdoms than their ethical horizons. The myth of Confucius as this all-knowing oracle is seductive, but it's a bit like thinking your favorite pop star writes all their own songs. The reality is that Confucius was a thinker and a teacher, not a prophet. His wisdom was hard-earned, born from a lifetime of observation and reflection, not divine revelation. He was a man who dared to imagine a better world and had the audacity to try and create it, one lesson at a time. So, while Confucius didn't wield a magic wand to solve society's problems, he did offer a blueprint for building a more virtuous world. His philosophy was about the art of becoming, the constant pursuit of self-improvement and moral excellence. And if that sounds like a tall order, well, it was. But for Confucius, the journey was as important as the destination. As we continue to explore the life and times of this remarkable thinker, remember that Confucius' story is far from finished. His teachings would go on to shape the cultural and philosophical landscape of China in ways he could never have imagined. But for now, let's leave him here, a man with a vision, a teacher with a mission, and a philosopher who dared to dream of a world governed by virtue rather than violence. Stay tuned as we unravel more of this ancient tale in the chapters to come. As we pick up Confucius' story, he was less a sage sitting under a bardhai tree and more like an ancient stand-up comedian making the rounds through China's warring states, trying to deliver a punchline about ethics in governance. Picture him, not as a wanderer with a bindle stick, but as a relentless traveler with a mission, crisscrossing the country to preach his brand of moral reform. If Confucius had a traveler's notebook, it would be filled with notes on statecraft, and maybe a doodle or two of rulers with donkey ears. In his later years, Confucius embarked on what you might call an unsolicited advice tour, taking his teachings on the road like a philosophical rock band. Only, instead of selling out arenas, he was trying to get an audience with rulers who were more interested in securing their thrones than their moral compasses. Armed with his trusty principles of Ren and Lai, he journeyed through various states like Wei, Song, and Chen, clocking more miles than a modern-day business traveler. Confucius' travels weren't exactly smooth sailing. For one, he was frequently met with skepticism. In an era where swords spoke louder than words, a philosopher preaching moral integrity was about as welcome as a tax collector at a feast. His ideas, while attractive in theory, were often dismissed in practice by rulers who preferred the tried-and-true methods of conquest and intrigue. Imagine trying to sell a self-help book titled Empathy in Governance to a warlord whose idea of diplomacy involved more swords than handshakes. Yet Confucius was nothing if not persistent, and his travels were peppered with both misfortune and revelation. In the state of Song, for instance, a ruler saw him as a threat and had a tree he was resting under chopped down, a not-so-subtle hint that his teachings were not welcome. This might have deterred a lesser man, but Confucius pressed on, driven by the belief that his ideas could bring about a renaissance of virtue and order. These travels weren't just about spreading his teachings, they were also a time for reflection and growth. Confucius was in his 50s and 60s during these years, a time when most might be thinking about retirement, not revolution. Yet he used each setback as a learning opportunity, refining his philosophy and deepening his understanding of human nature. He wasn't just a sage on a stage. He was a student of life, constantly evolving his ideas in response to the world around him. Despite his struggles, Confucius' reputation as a thinker and teacher began to grow. His circle of disciples expanded, and these devoted followers became instrumental in spreading his teachings. These weren't just students. They were ambassadors of his philosophy, carrying his ideas far beyond the borders of Lu. Names like Yan Hui, Zilu, and Zhengzi became synonymous with Confucian thought, each adding their own interpretations and experiences to the growing body of work. By the time Confucius returned to Lu, he was a changed man. His travels had exposed him to the harsh realities of political life, but they had also reaffirmed his commitment to his ideals. Back in Lu, he continued to teach, but his focus shifted from trying to change rulers to nurturing the next generation of thinkers. It was a pivot from the macro to the micro, from societal reform to personal development. Confucius' later years were a time of reflection, a chance to look back on his life's work and assess its impact. He once said, "At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the bounds of propriety." This was the voice of a man who had found peace with his path, even if the world had not yet caught up with his vision. His failures, as he saw them, were not in the lack of political change, but in the slow pace of societal evolution. In his twilight years, Confucius wasn't resting on his laurels. He was still refining and expanding his teachings. His disciples continued to gather his sayings and compile them into what would become the Analects, a collection of his thoughts that would serve as a cornerstone of Chinese philosophy. These later years were marked by a growing recognition of his contributions, not just among his students, but in the wider intellectual community. The myth of Confucius as a lone philosopher in a sea of chaos is compelling, but the reality is richer. He was a man of deep conviction, whose life was a testament to the power of ideas in the face of adversity. His journey was far from over, and his teachings were poised to outlast empires, shaping the cultural and moral landscape of China for centuries. As we pause in this narrative, remember that Confucius' story is one of perseverance and vision. His later years were a blend of challenge and triumph, a period of growth and reflection that solidified his legacy. Even as he grappled with the realities of his time, he remained a beacon of hope for a better future. The journey of Confucius is a reminder that, while the world may not always be ready for change, the seeds of transformation can take root in the most unlikely of places. And with that, we leave Confucius for now, poised on the brink of a legacy that would echo through history like the resounding note of a well-struck gong. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the final chapters of this extraordinary saga. Confucius stood on the precipice of his legacy, a man whose life was a masterclass in perseverance and philosophical grit. The year was 479 BCE, and Confucius, at the age of 72, was nearing the end of his earthly journey. As he prepared to shuffle off this mortal coil, he could look back on a life filled with more philosophical epiphanies than political victories. His teachings, which had once been the intellectual equivalent of shouting into the wind, were now beginning to take root, thanks in large part to his band of devoted disciples. Let's talk about the Analects, the ancient world's version of a philosophical mixtape. Compiled by Confucius' disciples after his death, this collection of sayings and ideas became the cornerstone of Confucian thought. These were the greatest hits of his teachings, recorded not with quills or parchment, but with brush and bamboo slips. The disciples, names like Zhengzi and Yan Hui, took on the role of philosophical scribes, preserving their master's wisdom for posterity. The Analects were more than just a compilation. They were a manifesto for a society that desperately needed a moral compass. And if you're thinking the Analects were some kind of overnight bestseller, think again. It took years, even centuries, for Confucianism to gain traction. In the immediate aftermath of Confucius' death, his teachings were like that indie band everyone had heard of, but no one had really listened to. The Warring States period wasn't exactly fertile ground for philosophical growth, what with all the warring and such. But as the dust of conflict settled, rulers began to see the appeal of Confucian ideals, especially when it came to governance. Ren and Lai, those twin pillars of his philosophy, offered a blueprint for stability in an otherwise unstable world. Fast forward to the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 years after Confucius' death, and his ideas were finally getting their due. Emperor Wu of Han made Confucianism the state ideology, a move that turned the philosopher's teachings into the ideological backbone of Chinese civilization. It was like Confucius had finally landed a residency in the imperial palace after years of playing philosophical dive bars. The Han rulers recognized that Confucianism provided a framework for social harmony and ethical governance, and they weren't about to let that treasure slip through their fingers. But let's not get carried away with romanticizing Confucius as a sage who had it all figured out from the get-go. The reality was that his teachings were as much a product of trial and error as they were of wisdom and insight. Confucius didn't have all the answers. He just asked better questions. His ideas about moral integrity and ritual propriety were as much about navigating the complexities of human nature as they were about lofty ideals. Here's the kicker. Confucius' rise to intellectual stardom wasn't just about the appeal of his ideas. It was also about timing. As China transitioned from the chaos of the Warring States to the relative stability of the Han Dynasty, the need for a unifying ideology was more pressing than ever. Confucianism hitched a ride on the coattails of this societal shift, transforming from a fringe philosophy into the cultural and moral bedrock of Chinese society. Yet, as with any legend worth its salt, myths about Confucius abound. One popular narrative paints him as the infallible sage, a kind of ancient superhero in a robe. But peel back the layers of legend, and you find a man who was as flawed and human as the rest of us. He wasn't born with a scroll in hand, dispensing wisdom like a PEZ dispenser. No, Confucius was a man of his time, shaped by the social and political upheavals of the Zhou dynasty. His wisdom was a product of experience, observation, and a healthy dose of skepticism about human nature. Confucius' legacy is a testament to the power of ideas, not just in shaping individual lives, but in molding entire civilizations. His teachings weren't just about personal moral development. They were about crafting a society where virtue was more than just a word on a scroll. In a world that often seemed hostile to idealism, Confucius dared to imagine a society governed by empathy and ethical conduct. It was a vision that resonated with people across generations, transcending the limitations of its time to become a universal blueprint for moral living. As we wrap up this journey through the life and legacy of Confucius, let's not forget the sharp observations this remarkable thinker left us with. He once said, "Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance," a cheeky reminder that even the wisest among us don't have all the answers. Confucius' life was a testament to the pursuit of wisdom, a reminder that the journey toward understanding is just as important as the destination. In the end, Confucius' story is one of enduring relevance. His teachings continue to influence not just China, but philosophical thought worldwide. He was a man who dared to dream of a better world, not through conquest or coercion, but through the transformative power of ideas. So, as you drift off to sleep, ponder this. In a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable, the legacy of Confucius offers a beacon of stability, a reminder that the path to a better society begins with the simple act of asking the right questions. And with that, we bid adieu to Confucius, a philosopher whose legacy echoes through history like a resonant gong, reminding us that the pursuit of virtue is a journey worth taking. The streets of Alexandria in 370 CE were alive with the clamor of merchants hawking their wares, the scent of exotic spices hanging in the air like an ancient Instagram filter for your nostrils. In this bustling metropolis, where Greek, Roman, and Egyptian influences mingled like the world's first cultural fusion restaurant, stood a young woman destined to become a legend Hypatia. Now, if you're thinking this is going to be one of those tales of a damsel in distress or a sage whispering wisdom from a mountaintop, think again. Hypatia was more about theorems than tiaras, and her playground was the library, not a royal court. Hypatia was born into a world that was a swirling vortex of knowledge and chaos, much like trying to find a clean coffee mug in a college dorm. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a renowned mathematician and philosopher, which is a fancy way of saying he loved numbers like some people love cat videos. Theon didn't just see Hypatia as his daughter. She was his protege, and quite possibly his toughest math problem. With Theon as her personal tutor, Hypatia grew up surrounded by scrolls and intellectual debates, not exactly your typical bedtime story scenario. Life in Alexandria for Hypatia was like attending the ultimate university, minus the dorm parties and ramen noodles. The city was home to the Great Library, a place so legendary that its destruction still makes bibliophiles weep into their e-readers. Picture a place with hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the ancient equivalent of 1 million e-books, but without the option to click next. Scholars from all over the known world would have given their best toga just to spend a day there. And while they might not have had Wi-Fi, they had something even more powerful, a thirst for knowledge that fueled every corner of this intellectual powerhouse. But let's not get all romantic about it. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a haven for scholarly pursuits. It was also a political hotbed. The power struggles within its walls were as fierce as any reality show catfight, only with more philosophical debates and fewer dramatic hair flips. Theon, being the sage he was, navigated these tricky waters like a pro, ensuring Hypatia was exposed to the best and brightest minds, as well as the occasional academic spat. Hypatia's education was a blend of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, subjects that today might make some students want to hide under their desks. But for Hypatia, this was her playground. Imagine a young woman who could rattle off Euclidean geometry while the other kids were still figuring out the ABCs. She was a prodigy in a world where women were more likely to be found weaving at home than plotting planetary movements. And yet, here she was, striding through the intellectual corridors of Alexandria with a determination that could make a modern-day motivational speaker envious. Her father Theon was instrumental in shaping her mind, but let's not pretend he was a saint of paternal wisdom. Theon might have been a genius, but he was also a man of his time, with all the quirks and blind spots that entailed. He believed in Hypatia's potential, but also understood the harsh realities of the world they lived in. It was a world where the lines between science, religion, and politics were blurrier than a bad Zoom call, and navigating them required more than just brains. It required cunning and a dash of good fortune. In the vibrant city of Alexandria, Hypatia became something of a superstar. Her lectures at the Neoplatonic school attracted students from far and wide, eager to absorb her insights on mathematics and philosophy. Picture a classroom where instead of doodling in the margins, students were solving complex equations and debating the nature of the universe. She was respected by her peers and adored by her students, a feat that would make even the most seasoned professors today a little green with envy. But let's not sugarcoat this with sepia-toned nostalgia. Hypatia's rise to prominence wasn't just about intellectual prowess. It was also about defying the odds in a society that wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for women in academia. Her accomplishments were nothing short of revolutionary, and her presence in the academic world was a statement as bold as any protest sign. In a time when women were often seen as ornamental rather than intellectual, Hypatia's very existence was a challenge to the status quo. So, as we saunter through the streets of ancient Alexandria, with its bustling markets and scholarly debates, let's take a moment to appreciate Hypatia's early years. She was more than just a footnote in history. She was a force of nature, a woman who dared to dream big in a world that was all too happy to keep dreams small. Her story is just beginning, and as we continue to explore her life and legacy, let's remember that sometimes the most extraordinary tales come not from kings and conquerors, but from those who dared to count the stars. Hypatia's ascent in the scholarly ranks of Alexandria was nothing short of meteoric. Here she was, a woman in a toga, cracking open the mysteries of the universe like some cosmic detective, all while the rest of society was still trying to figure out how to keep their togas from slipping off. Lectures on Neoplatonism were like intellectual rock concerts, drawing students from every corner of the Mediterranean. This wasn't just a group of dusty scholars gathering to nod sagely at one another. It was more like an academic marsh pit with a side of deep philosophical musings. And here's the kicker. She achieved rock star status without a single tick-tock dance. Take that, modern influencers. So, what exactly was Neoplatonism, and why did it matter? In the simplest terms, it was a philosophical system that tried to explain everything from the nature of reality to the existence of the divine. Imagine trying to cram the meaning of life into a single lecture series. Hypatia's take on it was like a TED talk that somehow managed to cover both the cosmos and the human soul, leaving her audience both enlightened and slightly dizzy. Her fans weren't just passive spectators. They were disciples. Eagerly absorbing every word like it was the secret to immortality. But let's not get too swept up in the romanticism of it all. Hypatia's world was rife with political turbulence, a swirling storm of power struggles and ideological clashes that made Game of Thrones look like a cozy fireside chat. Alexandria was a city where philosophical debates could quickly turn into street brawls, with scrolls and sandaled feet flying. Hypatia had to navigate these treacherous waters with the deftness of a tightrope walker, balancing her intellectual pursuits with the harsh realities of a society perpetually on the brink of chaos. Yet Hypatia wasn't just a philosopher. She was a mathematician and astronomer of dazzling brilliance. Her work included commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica and Ptolemy's Almagest, both of which would have made modern calculus students break out in a cold sweat. And let's face it, any person who can make sense of Ptolemaic astronomy deserves a medal. We're talking about a geocentric model of the universe, where the Earth was the center and everything else awkwardly orbited around it, kind of like an ancient version of a middle school dance. Hypatia's insights helped to clarify these complex theories, even while operating under the constraints of the time. Her classroom was not just a forum for dry discussions. It was a crucible of innovation. Students didn't just learn from her, they were inspired to think like her. Picture a young scholar, eyes wide with the thrill of discovery, as they unraveled the intricacies of celestial mechanics. Hypatia's ability to transform complex ideas into accessible wisdom was legendary. Her lessons were a heady cocktail of theory and application, with a twist of inspiration. However, Alexandria's political landscape was a minefield. The city was a melting pot of cultures and religions, each vying for influence. In this cauldron of conflicting ideologies, Hypatia's popularity was both a blessing and a curse. While she enjoyed the patronage of some of the city's most powerful figures, her prominence also made her a target. It was like trying to maintain a steady course while riding a chariot through a battlefield. And let's not ignore the fact that being a woman in this environment was akin to walking a tightrope over a pit of ideological vipers. Hypatia's role as a woman of science in a patriarchal world was nothing short of revolutionary. She shattered the glass ceiling of her time with the force of a philosophical comet, leaving her male counterparts in awe, and perhaps a bit envious. Her existence was a bold declaration that intellect knew no gender, a concept that was as radical then as it is, unfortunately, still proving to be today. Despite the challenges, she cultivated a network of admirers who were not just students, but also future leaders and thinkers. Her classroom was a breeding ground for new ideas, where the seeds of intellectual revolution were sown. This was mentoring on a grand scale, where the exchange of ideas was as vital as the breath of life itself. Hypatia imparted not just knowledge, but also the courage to question, to explore, and to dare. And yet, amidst her academic triumphs, Hypatia's life was interwoven with the turbulent politics of Alexandria. She had to tread carefully amidst religious tensions and political upheaval. The city was a hotbed of sectarian rivalries, and being a prominent figure meant that she had to navigate these treacherous waters with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Her ability to maintain her status while avoiding the pitfalls of political intrigue was nothing short of a masterclass in survival. Hypatia's journey was not just a personal triumph, but a beacon of possibility, a spotlight on the potential of human intellect unfettered by societal constraints. Her legacy was not merely in the scrolls she left behind, but in the minds she illuminated. As her reputation grew, so did the challenges, but she faced them with the unyielding resolve of someone who knew that the pursuit of knowledge was worth any price. So, as we continue to unravel the tapestry of Hypatia's life, remember that her story is not just one of academic achievement, but of courage and resilience. Her journey through the intellectual labyrinth of Alexandria was a testament to the power of the human spirit to rise above the limitations of its time. As we look ahead to the next chapter of her story, let's keep in mind that while the stars may have been her guide, it was her unwavering determination that charted the course. As we continue to navigate the intellectual labyrinth of Alexandria, Hypatia's world starts to resemble less of a scholarly utopia and more of a political minefield. While she had mastered the art of philosophical discourse, the real challenge was the juggling act required to stay afloat amidst the rivalries of Alexandria's political bigwigs. Picture this, a city teetering on the edge of chaos, with religious tensions running harder than a midsummer's day in the Sahara. At the heart of this storm were two power players, Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, and Orsts, the Roman governor. Hypatia, whether she liked it or not, found herself caught in the middle of their epic tug-of-war. Now, Cyril wasn't your run-of-the-mill bishop. Imagine the kind of guy who wouldn't just tell you to repent, but might also remind you that he has the political clout to enforce it. Born around 376 CE, Cyril was as much a political animal as he was a spiritual leader. His ambition was as expansive as the Nile, and he had his eyes set on consolidating his power in Alexandria. On the opposite side of the ring stood Orsts, a Roman official tasked with keeping the peace. A tall order, considering Alexandria was to peaceful governance what a porcupine is to cuddling. In this ancient game of thrones, Hypatia's role was more than just a passive observer. Her influence as a scholar was undeniable, and her classroom wasn't just a hub of intellectual activity. It was where the next generation of thought leaders was being molded. This made her an invaluable ally or a formidable foe, depending on your vantage point. Orsts, recognizing her sway, sought her counsel. Here was a woman who could dissect the heavens and still manage to keep a foot firmly on the ground, qualities that Orsts desperately needed in a city boiling over with unrest. But hold your horses before jumping to the conclusion that Hypatia was some sort of political puppet. She wasn't the type to be easily swayed by the charms or pressures of power. Her allegiance was to the pursuit of knowledge, not political expediency. This might sound like a romantic notion, but it was a dangerous stance at a time when political neutrality was as rare as a rainstorm in the desert. The myth of Hypatia as a pagan martyr is one of those stories that sounds great over a campfire, but doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny. While it's true that she was a pagan in a city increasingly dominated by Christianity, her death was less about her religious beliefs and more about being in the wrong place at the wrong time politically. To understand the backdrop of Hypatia's life, you need to grasp the economic and social turmoil that Alexandria was going through. The city's economy was a complex web, relying heavily on trade. Picture a bustling port where spices from India mingled with grain from Egypt's fertile Nile Valley. With such wealth flowing through its docks, the stakes were high, and control over Alexandria meant control over one of the most significant economic engines of the ancient world. Cyril's ambitions extended beyond spiritual leadership. He wanted to dominate every facet of Alexandrian life. His conflicts with Orsts were as much about control of the city as they were about religious leadership. In 415 C, tensions reached a fever pitch. Cyril's supporters and Orst's backers clashed in the streets, turning Alexandria into a battleground. Hypatia, with her ties to Orsts, became a convenient scapegoat, a symbol of the city's old pagan ways that Cyril was so keen to eradicate. The truth is, Hypatia's death was not a simple case of religious martyrdom, but a grim reminder of how easily reason can be trampled by the stampede of political ambition. Her murder at the hands of a Christian mob was a brutal act of political expediency masked as religious fervor. It wasn't that Cyril had a personal vendetta against her. Rather, she became a pawn in a larger game. The mythologizing of her death has often obscured the harsh reality. She was a victim of political machinations rather than religious persecution. In the grand tapestry of history, Hypatia's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual isolation in a world driven by political power plays. Her legacy is one of resilience and brilliance, yet it's also a sobering reminder of how easily the light of reason can be extinguished by the dark tides of human ambition. As we wrap our minds around the complexities of Hypatia's world, we see her not just as a scholar, but as a symbol of the perpetual struggle between knowledge and power, a struggle that echoes through the corridors of history to this day. So, as we pause to reflect on Hypatia's role amidst the political drama of Alexandria, let's remember that her story is far from over. The next chapter in her saga will delve deeper into the aftermath of her death and the indelible mark she left on the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Stay tuned, because the tapestry of Hypatia's life is woven with threads of intrigue, betrayal, and an unyielding quest for enlightenment. And so, the stage was set for one of history's most tragic finales, with Hypatia caught in the crossfire of a city that seemed to have misplaced its sanity somewhere between the agora and the amphitheater. Alexandria in 415 CE was like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding, with Hypatia unknowingly standing right on top of it. The socio-political tensions had escalated to the point where even the city's famed cats were probably eyeing each other suspiciously. Alexandria's streets weren't just paved with cobblestones. They were laid with the fault lines of a city divided. The split was as old as the city's founding, with religious factions vying for dominance and political leaders trying to hold the whole precarious mess together. Cyril and Orsts were the latest in a long line of frenemies, their chess game of power struggles making Moscow in winter look like a tropical paradise. But while these two were busy plotting their next moves, Hypatia was the unexpected piece that neither side had fully accounted for, a brilliant scholar who wasn't playing by anyone's rules but her own. Her death, when it came, was less a bolt from the blue and more a slow burn that had been simmering for months. It was March 415 CE when a mob, fueled by a cocktail of religious zeal, political ambition, and perhaps a touch too much ancient ale, decided to take matters into their own hands. They found Hypatia riding in a chariot, possibly the ancient equivalent of getting stuck in traffic, and dragged her to a nearby church, the Caesareum. What followed was a scene so brutal it makes today's horror flicks look like kiddie cartoons. Hypatia was stripped, flayed with ostraka, ceramic shards, and her remains were burned. It's the kind of grim reality that leaves you shaking your head at humanity's ability to mix piety with brutality. Now, you might think this barbarity was driven by some deep-seated theological debate, but the sad truth is, it was political convenience dressed up in religious garb. Cyril's goal wasn't to snuff out paganism, but to consolidate his power over Alexandria, and eliminating Hypatia removed a key ally of his political rival, Orsts. The myth of Hypatia as a martyr for paganism is less about historical accuracy and more about the appeal of a good story, a narrative that paints her as a symbol of lost wisdom rather than a victim of political expediency. The economic context of Alexandria during this period only added fuel to the fire. The city was a hub of trade, with its economy as diverse as the wares in its markets. Controlling Alexandria meant controlling a significant flow of goods, from Egyptian grain to Indian spices, and the stakes were high. The rivalry between Cyril and Orsts was as much about who would direct this economic powerhouse as it was about religious control. In such a charged atmosphere, a figure like Hypatia, who challenged the norms simply by existing as a female intellectual authority, was an easy target to rally against. But let's not pretend she was an innocent bystander caught unawares. Hypatia was acutely aware of the dangers of her position, a woman navigating the treacherous waters of politics with no more protection than her intellect and reputation. She knew the risks, but her commitment to her intellectual pursuits was unshakable. In many ways, she was like a modern-day whistleblower, shining a light where others preferred darkness. Yet the mob that murdered her wasn't just acting out of mindless rage. They were a symptom of the broader socio-political disease infecting Alexandria. It's easy to vilify them through the lens of history, but they were, in many respects, ordinary people caught up in the fervor of the times. The tragedy here is not just the loss of a brilliant mind, but the reminder of how easily a crowd can be swayed by the tides of rhetoric and power. It's a story as old as democracy itself, and as current as the latest headline. In the aftermath of Hypatia's death, Alexandria was left to grapple with the consequences. The city didn't suddenly become a bastion of peace and unity. If anything, the tensions only simmered under the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite them. But Hypatia's legacy endured, her life becoming a symbol for the enduring struggle between knowledge and ignorance, reason and fanaticism. Her murder was a turning point, not just for Alexandria, but for the wider world, highlighting the fragility of intellectual freedom in the face of political ambition. So, as we leave this chapter of Hypatia's life, let's hold on to the lessons it offers. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting power and politics trample over reason and understanding. It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is never without risk, but also that it's a quest worth undertaking. And while Hypatia's life was tragically cut short, her impact reverberates through history, a beacon of the possibilities when courage meets intellect. Stay tuned, because the ripples of her legacy are far from finished making waves. As Hypatia's story sinks into the annals of history, we're left to ponder the aftermath, like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the box cover doesn't match the picture. Her legacy, much like a persistent ghost, refuses to be laid to rest, haunting the corridors of science, philosophy, and feminist history with a tenacity that would put any poltergeist to shame. Hypatia's influence on science and philosophy is like a pebble dropped into the ocean, sending ripples that stretch far beyond her lifetime. Her work on mathematics and astronomy laid a foundation that scholars would build upon for centuries. Take her contributions to algebra, for instance. She wrote commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, a text that was so complex it made modern calculus look like child's play, and which inspired later mathematicians to develop the field further. Her insights helped illuminate the path for mathematicians like Fibonacci, and much later, Descartes. It's like she handed them the intellectual equivalent of a flashlight, illuminating a path through the murky wilderness of numbers. But let's not get too misty-eyed about it. Hypatia's legacy in the realm of women's history is a mixed bag of inspiration and myth. The romanticized vision of Hypatia as a martyr for science and reason is tempting to cling to, like a literary security blanket. Yet, it's crucial to remember the harsh reality. She was a victim of political machination, not a saint sacrificed at the altar of knowledge. The allure of her story as a feminist icon is undeniable, though. In a world where women were often relegated to the sidelines, Hypatia's prominence in Alexandria was like a beacon in the fog of patriarchal norms. She was a woman who refused to play by the rules, defiantly carving out a space for herself in the male-dominated spheres of science and philosophy. This is where the lines between reality and legend blur, with Hypatia's image being co-opted by various movements throughout history. The Enlightenment thinkers, for instance, latched onto her story as a symbol of reason triumphing over ignorance. Fast forward to the 20th century, and she's repurposed again, this time as a feminist icon in the fight for gender equality. The suffragettes of the early 1900s invoked her name as an emblem of the intellectual potential of women, a rallying cry for those demanding a seat at the academic table. Her story has been told and retold, each iteration adding a new layer of meaning, much like a Russian nesting doll of historical interpretation. Yet, the real Hypatia, the woman behind the myth, remains elusive. We have no surviving writings from her hand, only second-hand accounts from her students and contemporaries. It's like trying to understand an extinct language from a handful of phrases scribbled on a cave wall. This lack of concrete evidence has only fueled the fires of speculation and romanticism, allowing her story to be molded to fit the narrative needs of each generation. But isn't that the way with most legends? They endure because they can be reshaped to reflect the hopes and fears of those who tell them. In the modern world, Hypatia's legacy continues to resonate, an intellectual siren call beckoning to scientists, philosophers, and feminists alike. Her life story serves as a reminder of the importance of questioning established narratives and challenging the status quo. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in 415 CE, a call to arms for those who dare to dream beyond the confines of their circumstances. In an era where misinformation can spread faster than a viral TikTok dance, the need for critical thinking and the courage to question is more vital than ever. Hypatia's story, with its blend of brilliance and tragedy, offers us a mirror to examine our own world. Her life was a testament to the power of intellect over ignorance, a narrative that continues to inspire those who seek to push the boundaries of human understanding. As we reflect on her legacy, we're reminded of the importance of preserving intellectual freedom, safeguarding it against the tides of political expedience and zealotry. In the end, Hypatia's life and death teach us that the pursuit of knowledge is often fraught with peril, yet it remains a journey worth undertaking. Her story is a call to action, urging us to persist in our quest for truth and understanding, no matter the obstacles. So as we close the chapter on Hypatia, let's carry her legacy forward, honoring not just the legend, but also the complex, brilliant woman who dared to count the stars in a world that would have preferred her to stay silent. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that silence is the enemy of progress. And in the words of Hypatia, reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. In the bustling heart of 9th century Baghdad, where the air was thick with the scent of spices and ambition, a young Persian named Muhammad ibn Musa Al-Khwarizmi was busy cooking up something more potent than the latest batch of Silk Road spices. He was laying the groundwork for algebra. Yep, that brain-twisting subject that made high school a nightmare for many had a humble beginning in the mind of this mathematical maestro. Born into a world where the Abbasid Caliphate was the apex of cultural and intellectual life, Al-Khwarizmi found himself at the center of a knowledge boom, the likes of which we might compare to the tech explosion of the 1990. Only instead of coding in Silicon Valley garages, these scholars were scrawling equations on parchment in the House of Wisdom. Now, let's set the scene. Baghdad, round the year 780 AD, an intellectual petri dish if there ever was one. The Abbasids, who took power in 750 AD, were bent on turning their capital into a beacon of learning. Libraries were more common than fast food joints, and scholars were the rock stars of the day. Knowledge was the currency, and everyone wanted a piece. In this heady mix of ideas, languages, and cultures, the House of Wisdom emerged like a medieval Googleplex. Picture scholars from every corner of the known world lounging around, debating everything from astronomy to Aristotle, with a fervor usually reserved for sports fans arguing about the all-time greatest team. Al-Khwarizmi was like the Steve Jobs of his time, but instead of iPhones, he was obsessed with numbers. He was particularly fascinated by Indian numerals and the concept of zero, something the Romans had failed to figure out while they were busy conquering Europe. His early work was all about translating and synthesizing these foreign ideas, turning them into something usable for the Islamic world. In a way, he was like an intellectual DJ, remixing old hits into a new genre altogether. His work at the House of Wisdom was like being at the epicenter of a massive medieval think tank. This was the place where the minds of the era gathered like a hive of caffeinated bees, buzzing with the excitement of discovery. It was here that Al-Khwarizmi penned his most famous work, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab Algebra wal Muqabala, a title that's a mouthful but essentially translates to the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. And before you ask, yes, this is the book that coined the term algebra. Algebra didn't just pop out of nowhere like a rabbit out of a hat. It was the result of meticulous work and a fair bit of cross-cultural borrowing. Al-Khwarizmi wasn't inventing math from scratch. He was building on the shoulders of giants from India and Greece. But his genius lay in synthesizing these ideas into a coherent system, a toolkit for solving equations that would be indispensable for centuries to come. But let's not romanticize the guy too much. While Al-Khwarizmi was undoubtedly brilliant, he was also a man of his time. There's no evidence that he foresaw algebra's future role in making teenagers miserable worldwide. His focus was practical, solving problems of inheritance, trade, and land measurement. You know, the kind of stuff that made the medieval world go round. In a way, he was more like an ancient accountant than a classroom tormentor. The House of Wisdom, where he did much of his work, was a cross between a library, a university, and a research institute. Imagine a place where you could bump into a philosopher, an astronomer, and a mathematician all in the same hallway. This intellectual melting pot, funded by the caliphs who understood the power of knowledge, was a unique phenomenon. It was as if the rulers of the time had realized that the pen might indeed be mightier than the sword, at least when it came to running an empire. In the end, Al-Khwarizmi's contributions were nothing short of revolutionary. His work laid the foundation for modern mathematics, and his influence stretched across the globe, from the Islamic world to Europe and beyond. But let's be real. He probably didn't think he was drafting the blueprint for future math classrooms. He was just a guy in Baghdad, trying to make sense of numbers and leave the world a little more orderly than he found it. And for that, we owe him a nod of gratitude, even if algebra still makes our heads spin. Al-Khwarizmi's contributions were nothing short of revolutionary, but let's not hand him the Nobel Prize for making math a universal language just yet. His true genius lay in decoding the chaos of numbers in a way that was as revolutionary as sliced bread, if bread could somehow help you calculate trade profits. His magnum opus, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab Algebra wal Muqabala, was the medieval equivalent of a life hack. Instead of wrestling with unwieldy Roman numerals, merchants and scholars could now solve problems with a nifty system of equations that made financial transactions smoother than a Silk Road caravan. Imagine being a merchant in bustling Baghdad, where trade was as lively as a modern-day stock exchange. You had spices to sell, silks to buy, and profits to calculate quicker than you could say, discounted cash flow. But Roman numerals were about as useful for quick calculations as a chocolate teapot. Enter Al-Khwarizmi's algebraic methods, which turned these cumbersome calculations into something as manageable as checking your phone for the latest meme. Merchants could now compute and compare with ease, transforming commerce into a more streamlined and profitable endeavor. His methods were like a secret sauce that seasoned the Islamic golden age. It wasn't just about numbers on a page. It was about transforming the way people interacted with the world, and eventually the way the world functioned. The mathematical tools he crafted were as pivotal to trade as the camels that carried goods across deserts. Thanks to Al-Khwarizmi, calculating the value of goods, dividing inheritances, or determining land boundaries became tasks that didn't require a degree in ancient numerology. But the real kicker, his work didn't just stay in Baghdad, sipping coffee and discussing its brilliance in the confines of the House of Wisdom. No, it was like the original viral meme, spreading across continents and centuries, influencing the very fabric of European mathematical thought. When scholars in medieval Europe got wind of these algebraic methods, they were like kids in a candy store. They garbled up the knowledge, translating it into Latin and integrating it into their own burgeoning intellectual renaissance. This wasn't just a matter of cross-cultural intellectual exchange. It was an economic revolution. In a world where trade was king and profits reigned supreme, having the ability to accurately calculate and predict financial trends was akin to having a crystal ball. Al-Khwarizmi's work enabled merchants to operate with a precision that was previously unimaginable. It was like swapping a horse-drawn cart for a sports car in terms of efficiency. And let's not forget the social impact. As algebra made its way through the corridors of power and commerce, it began to democratize knowledge. Understanding complex calculations was no longer the exclusive domain of the elite. With algebra, even a modest trader could engage with the complexities of finance, breaking down social barriers in a way that was as revolutionary as the printing press would be centuries later. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, European scholars were still riding the wave of Al-Khwarizmi's innovations. His work had laid the groundwork for a mathematical awakening that would eventually lead to the likes of Newton and Leibniz. It was as though Al-Khwarizmi had set off a chain reaction, a mathematical Big Bang that would echo through the ages. But let's not get too carried away with the romanticism of it all. While Al-Khwarizmi's algebra was undoubtedly groundbreaking, it also came with its own set of challenges. Not everyone was thrilled with the idea of embracing these newfangled numbers and equations. For some, the transition from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals felt like trading traditional craftsmanship for mass-produced goods. Yet, despite the initial resistance, the practicality of Al-Khwarizmi's methods eventually won out. The economic benefits were simply too great to ignore, and the appeal of more efficient trade and commerce was irresistible. It's a testament to the power of practical innovation, a reminder that even the most groundbreaking ideas must prove their worth in the real world. So, while Al-Khwarizmi might not have foreseen the global impact of his work, he undoubtedly set the stage for future generations to build upon his ideas. His algebra was more than just a set of equations. It was a catalyst for change, a tool that reshaped the way we think about numbers, commerce, and the very fabric of our world. And in that sense, he truly was the father of algebra, a title he earned not just through his intellect, but through his ability to see the potential for a more ordered and understandable world. While Al-Khwarizmi might not have foreseen the global impact of his work, he undoubtedly set the stage for future generations to build upon his ideas. But let's pump the brakes on this algebraic love fest and dive into the nitty-gritty of the world that shaped him. Baghdad in the 9th century, a place where the possibilities were as endless as the spice market's inventory. Picture Baghdad as the Vegas of its time, but swap out the neon lights and slot machines for bustling bazaars and an intellectual scene so vibrant it could make the Renaissance look like a late bloomer. The city was the glittering jewel in the Abbasid Caliphate's crown, an empire that stretched across 3 continents like a well-placed throw rug. The Abbasids, no slouches in the brain department, understood that power wasn't just about wielding swords, it was about wielding ideas. So they invested in knowledge like it was the cryptocurrency of their day. Enter the House of Wisdom, the ultimate brain spa where scholars from every corner of the known world came together to sip coffee, chat Aristotle, and occasionally revolutionize mathematics. Now, it's easy to romanticize these scholars as isolated geniuses, scribbling away in solitude, but make no mistake, they were more like today's startup founders, hustling, networking, and pitching their intellectual wares to anyone who'd listen. Al-Khwarizmi was no exception. He had a keen eye for opportunity, and in a city where ideas were traded with the same fervor as silk and spices. He was in his element. The Abbasid Caliphate was like a giant intellectual incubator, and Al-Khwarizmi thrived under its patronage. The caliphs weren't just benevolent rulers. They were strategic investors in innovation, knowing full well that a well-educated populace could propel their empire to new heights. They poured resources into translating ancient texts, importing scholars, and generally making sure that Baghdad was the place to be if you had a brain and a penchant for learning. But let's not gloss over the economic backdrop that made all this possible. Baghdad was the epicenter of a trade network that made the Silk Road look like a sleepy cul-de-sac. Goods from China, India, Africa, and Europe passed through its markets, bringing with them not just material wealth, but a torrent of ideas and knowledge. The city's location on the Tigris River was no coincidence. It was a strategic decision that allowed for the kind of economic boom that funded the intellectual pursuits of the House of Wisdom. In today's terms, it was like having a tech hub right next to a major shipping port. Convenience meets commerce. Al-Khwarizmi himself was a product of this bustling milieu. Far from being a lone wolf, he was more like a venture capitalist of ideas, synthesizing knowledge from diverse sources and packaging it into something new and groundbreaking. His fascination with Indian numerals and the concept of zero wasn't just academic curiosity. It was a savvy recognition of the practical tools that could revolutionize trade and commerce. After all, in a city where merchants needed to calculate profits faster than you could say, supply chain management, having a mathematical system that made calculations as smooth as silk was pure gold. Of course, not everything about this era was as rosy as the romantic tales would have us believe. For every scholar in the House of Wisdom, there were probably a dozen who were more interested in maintaining the status quo than in embracing newfangled ideas. The transition from Roman to Arabic numerals wasn't exactly met with open arms by everyone. For some, it felt like trading handcrafted artisan goods for mass-produced trinkets. Yet, the undeniable economic benefits eventually swayed even the most skeptical minds. And let's talk about PR spin, because even in the 9th century, image was everything. The Abbasid rulers were masters at crafting a narrative that painted their empire as the pinnacle of enlightenment. They understood that a strong brand could wield as much power as a standing army. By promoting Baghdad as a hub of knowledge and innovation, they cemented their legacy as patrons of the arts and sciences. It was a shrewd move that not only attracted the best minds of the day, but also ensured that their empire would be remembered as a beacon of learning. Al-Khwarizmi, in this context, was both a beneficiary and a contributor to this image-building exercise. His work was not just a personal achievement. It was part of a larger cultural narrative that celebrated intellectual pursuit as the highest form of human endeavor. Yet, behind the polished facade of enlightened scholarship lay a more complex reality, one where politics, economics, and personal ambition intertwined in ways that were as intricate as the geometrical patterns adorning the city's architecture. As we sift through the legends and the layers of PR gloss, one thing becomes clear. Al-Khwarizmi was very much a man of his time, navigating the currents of a society that prized knowledge as its most valuable currency. He wasn't just solving equations, he was solving the problems of his world, one calculation at a time. And in doing so, he carved out a legacy that would ripple through the ages, touching everything from trade to technology. So, let's raise a metaphorical glass to Al-Khwarizmi, the ultimate intellectual entrepreneur of the Abbasid era. He was a pioneer who saw the potential in numbers and equations to transform not just his city, but the entire known world. And while we might still grumble about algebra today, there's no denying that his contributions laid the groundwork for a future where knowledge was power, and ideas were the true currency of the realm. Al-Khwarizmi, the ultimate intellectual entrepreneur of the Abbasid era, was just getting started on his epic journey through history. After setting the stage in Baghdad, his work was destined to pack its metaphorical bags and embark on a continental tour that would make even the most seasoned rock stars envious. You see, the story of Al-Khwarizmi's algebra didn't end in the bustling streets of Baghdad. It was just the opening act for a much larger performance that would captivate Europe and beyond. Enter the translation movement, a scholarly relay race that spanned continents and centuries. The 12th century saw the dawn of an intellectual revival in Europe, often dubbed the 12th century Renaissance, a time when dusty old manuscripts were the hardest items on the medieval market. In this whirlwind of knowledge transfer, Al-Khwarizmi's works found themselves in the hands of eager European scholars. His Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab Algebra wal Muqabala was translated into Latin, and suddenly Al-Khwarizmi became a household name, or as close as one could get in an era without Instagram. These translations weren't just linguistic exercises, they were cultural bridges. They transformed Algebra into the algebra we know today, a word that might still give you hives, but is undeniably integral to the modern world. The Latin version, Algorithmi de Numero Indorum, not only introduced algebra, but also gave us the term algorithm, thanks to a delightful mangling of Al-Khwarizmi's name. It's a bit like naming your band after an accidental typo, yet it's stuck. The irony, while the Europeans were struggling to wrap their heads around these new concepts, they were inadvertently laying the groundwork for everything from calculus to computer science. Talk about a happy accident. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the so-called Dark Ages. Picture a time when Europe was supposedly in a cultural coma, a narrative that's been as persistent as a medieval plague. But hold your horses, because this myth is about as accurate as claiming the Earth is flat. Spoiler, it's not. The truth is, Europe was bustling with intellectual exchanges, thanks in no small part to the Islamic world's hefty contributions. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra was a key ingredient in this intellectual cocktail, shaking up the status quo and adding some much-needed zest to the European scene. Yet, the journey wasn't all smooth sailing. Initially, Europeans treated Arabic numerals with the kind of suspicion you'd reserve for a dubious email from a Nigerian prince. Roman numerals were the old guard, stubbornly clinging to their numerical thrones. Imagine trying to do complex calculations with the equivalent of a typewriter when you have a shiny new laptop within reach. It was like trading a trusty old horse for a newfangled steam engine, exciting but intimidating. Despite the initial reluctance, practicality ultimately won the day. Arabic numerals were simply more efficient, and in a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected, efficiency was king. Merchants, scholars, and even the church began to see the light, or in this case, the numbers. The pennies dropped, and with them, the barriers to advanced calculations. Thanks to Al-Khwarizmi, Europe unlocked new levels of mathematical understanding, paving the way for the Renaissance. As the Renaissance bloomed across Europe, the echoes of Al-Khwarizmi's work resonated in the halls of academia. His algebra became the bedrock upon which scholars like Fibonacci, the famous Italian mathematician, built their theories. Fibonacci, who introduced the sequence that bears his name, was particularly taken with Al-Khwarizmi's methods, integrating them into his own works and spreading the numerical gospel further. But it wasn't just about numbers and equations. Al-Khwarizmi's influence was a catalyst for cultural cross-pollination, as European scholars began to look eastward for inspiration. This intellectual exchange was the lifeblood of the Renaissance, a period that would eventually give birth to luminaries like Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo. They stood on the shoulders of giants, and Al-Khwarizmi was certainly one of those towering figures, albeit with a name that was easier to write than pronounce. So, as the Renaissance picked up steam, it was fueled by the very ideas that had once crossed the Mediterranean like intellectual contraband. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra had morphed from an exotic import into a staple of European education, a tool that would help shape the modern world. From architecture to astronomy, his influence was felt in every corner of the emerging modern society. Of course, the story of Al-Khwarizmi's work isn't just a tale of triumph. It's also a sobering reminder of the fickle nature of history. For every scholar who embraced these new ideas, there were countless others who resisted, clinging to the old ways like a dog with a bone. Change, as they say, is the only constant, but it sure can be a bumpy ride. And yet, Al-Khwarizmi's legacy endured, a testament to the power of knowledge to transcend borders and eras. His work was a beacon of the intellectual exchanges that not only survived the so-called Dark Ages, but thrived, setting the stage for a future where algebra would become a universal language. It was a journey that was far from over, one that would continue to unfold in ways even Al-Khwarizmi couldn't have imagined. As we pause to catch our breath in this whirlwind tour of history, let's tip our hats to Al-Khwarizmi, the unwitting architect of mathematical modernity. His algebra was more than just a set of equations. It was a bridge between cultures, a spark that lit the fire of the Renaissance, and a gift that keeps on giving, one calculation at a time. But hold onto your calculators, because the story isn't over yet. There's more to come in this saga of numbers, innovation, and the relentless march of progress. As the story of Al-Khwarizmi's algebra takes its final bow, it's only fitting we explore his enduring influence on our modern world. A world that's far from the bustling bazaars of Baghdad, but is steeped in the mathematical principles he once penned. Fast forward from the 9th century to the 21st, and you'll find that Al-Khwarizmi's legacy is as ubiquitous as a viral meme. It's woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, from the algorithms that power our search engines to the mathematical models that keep our airplanes aloft. Let's start with a term that owes its very existence to Al-Khwarizmi, the algorithm. This buzzword, often tossed around in tech circles like a frisbee at a park, is nothing short of the backbone of our digital world. Whether you're scrolling through your social media feed or trusting GPS to navigate a labyrinthine cityscape, algorithms are the unsung heroes making it all happen. The irony is almost poetic. A scholar from centuries ago is orchestrating the symphony of data that dictates everything from your next online purchase to the playlist that gets you through your morning jog. And speaking of data, let's talk about the financial world. Ever heard of compound interest? Of course, you have. It's the bane and boon of anyone with a savings account or a mortgage. While Al-Khwarizmi wasn't dealing with modern banks and their labyrinthine financial instruments, his algebra laid the groundwork for the mathematical calculations that underpin today's financial systems. The same principles that helped medieval merchants tally up trade profits now assist in calculating interest rates, investment returns, and even the complex algorithms that drive high-frequency trading on Wall Street. It's a testament to the timelessness of his work that the same equations are as relevant in a stock exchange as they were in a silk trade. But let's not get too caught up in the high-stakes world of finance and tech. Al-Khwarizmi's influence is also felt in the everyday, the mundane, and the beautifully ordinary. Take, for example, the humble calculator app on your smartphone. A few taps, a swipe, and voila, you've split the dinner bill without breaking a sweat. It's a far cry from the cumbersome abacuses and ink-stained parchments of old Baghdad. Yet, every time you calculate a tip or convert a recipe from ounces to grams, you're standing on Al-Khwarizmi's shoulders, blissfully unaware of the centuries-old legacy at your fingertips. Now, let's zoom out for a moment and consider the broader impact on education. Algebra, once a revolutionary concept, is now a rite of passage for students worldwide. Love it or hate it, it's a universal language that teaches us not just about numbers, but about problem-solving and critical thinking, the very skills that Al-Khwarizmi honed in the intellectual corridors of the House of Wisdom are today shaping the minds of future engineers, scientists, and yes, even historians. It's as if he's whispering through the ages, urging us to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be, a place of order and logic amidst the chaos. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room, algebra's less-than-stellar reputation. For many, it's the academic equivalent of a root canal, a painful but necessary evil. Yet, there's a strange beauty in this struggle. Al-Khwarizmi's work challenges us to stretch our minds, to grapple with the abstract, and to emerge victorious, or at least with a passing grade. It's a rite of passage that connects us with generations past, a shared experience that transcends time and space. As we wrap up this journey through history, let's take a moment to appreciate the delicious irony of it all. A man who lived over a millennium ago, in a world as foreign to us as the far side of the moon, is silently guiding us through our daily lives. From the algorithms that curate our Netflix recommendations to the algebraic equations that drive cutting-edge research in quantum physics, Al-Khwarizmi's fingerprints are everywhere. He's the unsung hero behind the scenes, the ghost in the machine, quietly orchestrating the symphony of modern life. So, Next time you punch numbers into your calculator or marvel at the precision of a complex algorithm, spare a thought for Al-Khwarizmi. He's the reason you can calculate the best route home during rush hour or find the perfect angle for your next Instagram photo. In a world obsessed with the new and the now, his legacy is a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the ones that stand the test of time. And as we drift into a mathematical dreamland, let's ponder a quote that captures the essence of this journey. Mathematics is the music of reason. In the symphony of history, Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra is the melody that has played on, echoing through the ages, guiding us from the sands of Baghdad to the digital landscapes of today. It's a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, a reminder that even in the face of change, some things remain timeless. Sweet dreams, and may your calculations always be accurate. In the grand tapestry of human history, the Byzantine Empire is that eccentric uncle who claims to have invented rock and roll. Sure, it didn't technically start the tune, but without its riffs, the song of medieval Europe would have been a lot more monotone. So let's dive into the Byzantine Empire, where emperors wore bejeweled slippers and tax collectors were treated like rock stars, if rock stars were universally despised, and had an uncanny ability to make everyone poorer. The Byzantine Empire was basically the Roman Empire in a snazzy new outfit, a sort of reboot that managed to outlive its Western counterpart by about 1,000 years. It all started in 330 AD, when Emperor Constantine decided that Rome was getting a bit too much like an overcrowded party with bad music and worse company. So, he shifted the capital to Byzantium, a modest city that he then rebranded with the catchy name, New Rome. Eventually, it just became Constantinople, because why not name a city after yourself when you're the emperor? Geographically, Constantinople was like the prime real estate of the ancient world. Nestled between the Aegean and the Black Sea, it was the only city that could boast about being part of both Europe and Asia, a feat that would make any modern-day real estate agent swoon. Its location meant it was a bustling hub of trade, and boy, did the Byzantines know how to trade. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia. If it was exotic and expensive, it passed through Constantinople. The city was so wealthy that its tax revenue alone could make a Wall Street banker blush. By the 6th century, the Byzantine economy was cranking out more gold than a reality TV show produces drama, with Constantinople as the glittering epicenter. This economic clout allowed the Byzantines to develop a bureaucracy that was as complex as it was efficient. Picture an army of scribes and officials, each more skilled in the art of paperwork than the last. Byzantine bureaucracy was like a Byzantine mosaic, intricate, colorful, and if you stared at it too long, you'd get a headache. But it worked. The tax system was so effective that it could squeeze coins from a statue. The state had a penchant for collecting taxes on everything from land to the air you breathed. Okay, maybe not the air, but it sometimes felt that way to the taxpayers. Now, let's talk about Byzantine diplomacy, which was less about shaking hands and more about outmaneuvering your opponent in a game of chess where half the pieces were missing. The Byzantines didn't have the largest army or the fiercest warriors, but they had cunning, a word often associated with them. However, the idea of Byzantine cunning being some sort of magical, infallible force is a bit of a myth. Sure, they had their moments of brilliance, like getting their enemies to fight each other while they sat back and ate grapes. But they also made some blunders that were as epic as their successes. One might imagine Byzantine diplomacy as a never-ending series of complex negotiations and backroom deals, but sometimes it was just good old-fashioned bribery. When you can't outfight them, outpay them. The Byzantines were masters at playing one barbarian tribe against another, promising gold to one, while subtly encouraging the other to take a hike. It was a bit like being the puppet master at a marionette show, where the puppets occasionally tried to set the stage on fire. Despite their reputation for scheming, the Byzantines were occasionally outfoxed by their own bureaucratic mazes. There's something almost endearing about an empire that could orchestrate an elaborate alliance, only to have it backfire, because someone forgot to double-check the fine print. But hey, even the best of us forget to read the terms and conditions sometimes. In the end, the Byzantine Empire wasn't the unerring bastion of cunning and control it's often painted as. It was a complex, vibrant, and sometimes chaotic entity that thrived on trade, diplomacy, and a tax system that would make modern accountants weep with envy. It wasn't perfect, but its influence on medieval Europe was profound. The Byzantine Empire may not have invented the wheel, but it sure knew how to keep it turning. And that's a legacy that even the most rock-and-roll uncle can respect. And speaking of legacies, let's dive into one of the Byzantine's greatest hits, their role as the unsung librarians of the ancient world. While the Western Roman Empire was busy collapsing in dramatic fashion, the Byzantines were quietly hoarding the intellectual treasures of Greece and Rome like a dragon with a penchant for scrolls. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, they copied it, commented on it, and sometimes even dared to improve upon it. This wasn't just some hobby for rainy days, it was a full-scale operation. The Byzantine Empire was a cultural bridge, a sort of intellectual relay race where the baton was handed over not in a sprint, but over centuries. When the Western Empire was too busy imploding, the Byzantines were translating and transcribing every Aristotle and Euclid they could get their hands on. In fact, it's estimated that between the 9th and 12th centuries, Byzantine scholars produced hundreds of copies of classical manuscripts, many of which would have been lost to time without their intervention. Think of them as the original backup drive for Western civilization. Their efforts weren't just about dusty old texts, though. The Byzantines had a knack for adding their own flair to the knowledge they inherited. Ever heard of the term Byzantine science? Probably not, because it doesn't roll off the tongue like Newtonian physics, but it's a thing. They were particularly fond of astronomy and medicine. The 11th century scholar Michael Sellos was like the Bill Nye of Byzantium, minus the bow tie, dabbling in everything from alchemy to theology. Thanks to this intellectual fervor, Byzantine culture was like a rich tapestry where ancient Greek thought and Christian theology were woven together in vibrant, sometimes dizzying patterns. Now, if you're under the impression that the Renaissance was simply born out of the so-called Dark Ages, like some phoenix rising from the ashes, prepare for a plot twist. The Renaissance didn't just pop up spontaneously in Florence one sunny afternoon because some artist decided they liked the look of ancient statues. No, it owed a pretty big debt to those Byzantine scholars who had been safeguarding the blueprints of Western thought for centuries. When Byzantine intellectuals started fleeing westward due to the Ottoman threat, they packed their bags with more than just personal belongings. They brought with them precious manuscripts and a wealth of knowledge that would light the Renaissance's proverbial match. Consider the Council of Florence in 1439, a meeting meant to discuss religious matters that inadvertently turned into an intellectual exchange program. Byzantine scholars like George Gemistos Plethon introduced Italian humanists to Plato's works, which by that point had been collecting dust in the West. The Italians were like kids in a candy store, eagerly rediscovering classical philosophy with a newfound zeal. It was like introducing a new generation to vinyl records. They didn't invent it, but they sure knew how to spin it. But let's not get too romantic about it. The idea that the Renaissance was solely a rebirth from the Dark Ages is a bit like saying your phone suddenly works better because it had a nap. In reality, the knowledge had been there all along, carefully curated by Byzantine hands. They ensured that when Europe was ready to listen again, the wisdom of the ancients would be there, waiting patiently. Of course, the Byzantine influence wasn't just about dusty old scrolls and philosophical debates. Their cultural exchange included the arts, architecture, and even fashion. Byzantine mosaics, with their glittering gold tiles, were like the Instagram influencers of their day. Everybody wanted to emulate them. And let's not forget the architectural wonder that is Hagia Sophia. When it was completed in 537 AD, it was the largest cathedral in the world. Its massive dome was considered a marvel of engineering. Western architects would later look to it for inspiration, proving that sometimes the best ideas come from peeking over your neighbor's fence. It wasn't all high-minded art and philosophy, though. The Byzantines also exported their fair share of religious controversy. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church were like two squabbling siblings, constantly bickering over theology and ecclesiastical power. This culminated in the Great Schism of 1054, a dramatic breakup that would have made even the messiest celebrity divorce look tame. The Byzantines' role in this schism meant that they exported not just culture and knowledge, but also division and rivalry. A reminder that intellectual exchange is rarely a one-way street of enlightenment. In sum, while medieval Europe was busy wearing sackcloth and waging intermittent wars, the Byzantines were playing the long game, quietly laying the groundwork for a cultural renaissance that would eventually sweep across the continent. They were the guardians of knowledge, the middlemen in a grand intellectual trade that spanned centuries. And like any good middleman, they knew how to keep things moving, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients wasn't lost, but merely waiting for the right moment to shine once more. As Europe was busy dusting off its classical scrolls and bickering over theological fine print, the Byzantines were sharpening their swords and plotting military strategies that would leave medieval Europe both awed and baffled. You see, if Byzantine diplomacy was like a chess game with missing pieces, then their military was like a chessboard where the pieces were on fire, literally. Enter Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's not-so-secret weapon that could have turned the tide in any Game of Thrones episode. Greek fire was basically the medieval equivalent of a flamethrower, but with the added bonus of being able to ignite on water. Think of it as nature's way of saying, you thought the seas were safe. Think again. First used in 672 AD against the Arab fleets threatening Constantinople, Greek fire was a concoction so secret that even today, historians and chemists can only guess at its exact composition. Some say it involved pine resin, quicklime, and sulfur, but the truth is, the Byzantines guarded this formula more closely than a pizza place guards its dough recipe. Imagine if Coca-Cola had a medieval predecessor, and instead of a fizzy drink, it was a boat-burning concoction. That's Greek fire for you. The impact of Greek fire was so profound that it inspired countless legends and fueled the imagination of generations. Medieval chroniclers wrote about it with a mix of awe and terror, describing how it clung to ships like a fiery vice and turned naval battles into scenes from Dante's Inferno. But before we romanticize it too much, let's remember that Greek fire was less about heroic knights and more about strategic pyromania. It was the kind of thing that made enemies think twice before planning a surprise visit to your shores. But Greek fire was just one aspect of the Byzantine military's ingenuity. The Byzantines were like the MacGyvers of medieval warfare, always finding creative solutions to the challenges they faced. Their military strategies were a blend of Roman legacy and Byzantine adaptability, making them formidable opponents despite not having the largest armies. Take the themata system, for instance. This was the Byzantine version of a military draft, where soldiers were settled on land in exchange for military service. It was a clever way to ensure that the empire had a ready supply of troops without having to break the bank. The themata system was efficient, but it wasn't without its flaws. Over time, it led to local commanders gaining too much power, a bit like giving your regional manager the keys to the company's safe. It was a system that worked best under strong central authority, which, let's be honest, is easier said than maintained in an empire spanning thousands of miles. The Byzantines, though, knew how to play the long game. They relied on strategic fortifications and well-defended cities, using walls and geography to their advantage. The walls of Constantinople, for instance, were the medieval equivalent of a keep-out sign, reinforced with moats and towers that made any would-be invader think twice. While we're on the subject of defense, let's talk about how the Byzantines made passive aggressiveness an art form. They mastered the use of strategic retreats and feigned withdrawals to lure enemies into traps. It was a military ballet of sorts, with the Byzantines playing the role of the teasing matador to the enemy's bull. This tactic, known as the strategos maneuver, was about as subtle as a wink and a nudge, but it worked more often than not. Despite these sophisticated strategies, the Byzantine military was not without its challenges. The empire was constantly sandwiched between hostile neighbors, from the Bulgars in the north to the Arabs in the south. It was like living in a neighborhood where everyone wants to borrow sugar and never give it back. The Byzantine military had to be not just a fighting force, but a flexible one, able to adapt to different terrains and tactics. That they managed to hold their own for so long is a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. Now, let's dispel a few myths about Byzantine military prowess. First, the idea that they were invincible masterminds of warfare is a historical exaggeration. Sure, they had their moments of brilliance, but they also faced crushing defeats. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was a particularly nasty wake-up call, where the Seljuk Turks handed the Byzantines a defeat so thorough it left them reeling for decades. It was like losing the championship game, and then realizing you also left your wallet on the bus. Second, the notion that Byzantine military strategies were solely about cunning and deception overlooks the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Battles were brutal, often fought in muddy fields, where dysentery was as much an enemy as the opposing army. The Byzantines had to contend with these grim realities, just like everyone else. While their tactics could dazzle, the day-to-day life of a Byzantine soldier was more about enduring hardships and less about starring in epic tales of valor. As we look at how the Byzantines influenced European warfare, it's clear that their legacy was one of adaptation and innovation. European powers watched and learned, incorporating Byzantine tactics into their own arsenals. The use of fortified cities, strategic retreats, and even the idea of a professional standing army were concepts that would echo across the continent. The Byzantines were like the older sibling who figured out the best way to sneak out past curfew, and their younger European siblings took notes. But let's not get too rosy-eyed about it. The Byzantines' influence on European warfare was as much about necessity as it was about brilliance. In a world where allegiances shifted faster than the wind, the Byzantines had to be both warriors and diplomats, balancing on a tightrope of survival. Their story is one of ingenuity in the face of adversity, a tale as complex as the empire itself. So, as we prepare to delve deeper into the Byzantine legacy, remember this. The empire was a masterclass in the art of survival, where every move was calculated, and every strategy was a blend of ancient wisdom and on-the-fly improvisation. The Byzantines may not have reinvented the art of war, but they sure knew how to keep the game interesting. And in the grand theater of history, that's a curtain call worth remembering. As we continue our journey through Byzantine influence, keep your shields up and your wits about you. There's much more to come. As we slide from military maneuvers to the ecclesiastical chess game that was Byzantine religious life, let's brace ourselves for a tale of epic proportions. The Great Schism of 1054. This wasn't just a religious spat. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of Fleetwood Mac's Rumours album, full of drama, division, and more than a few high notes. In 1054, the Christian church, which until then was like a sprawling family reunion with a lot of awkward small talk, decided to split into two branches, the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the east. Why? Well, it was less about theological precision and more about who got to wear the fancy hat. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, was the epicenter of Orthodox Christianity, while Rome helmed the Catholic contingent. These two centers were like estranged siblings arguing over who got to sit at the head of the dinner table. At the heart of the schism were two big egos, Pope Leo Roman IX in Rome and Patriarch Michael Euulerius in Constantinople. Think of them as the 11th century version of a Twitter feud, but with way more incense and candles. The bone of contention, filioque, a Latin word meaning, and the Son, which was added to the Nicene Creed by the Western Church. This seemingly small edit was akin to adding pineapple to pizza, something that split opinions and left friendships in tatters. But the filioque was just the tip of the theological iceberg. The real issue was authority. Rome insisted that the Pope was the supreme leader of all Christendom, while Constantinople saw the Pope as just another bishop. Imagine the Roman Church as the kid who wanted to be the boss of the playground game, and the Byzantines were having none of it. They were like, hey, our empire's got the spiritual lineage of Constantine and more gold leaf than your average cathedral, so maybe we know a thing or two about running this show. In July 1054, after a series of heated exchanges that would make a reality TV producer salivate, papal legates stormed into the Hagia Sophia and slapped a bull of excommunication on the altar. Euulerius returned the favor by excommunicating the legates in return. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of two people breaking up by changing their Facebook status to "it's complicated." The Great Schism wasn't a clean break, though. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck filled with theological debates that made the average medieval peasant's head spin. In the end, the official split wasn't fully cemented until the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Crusaders sacked Constantinople. Talk about adding insult to injury. Imagine crashing at your cousin's house and then selling their furniture on eBay. But was the schism really just about theology? Hardly. Economics played its part too. The Byzantine Empire, with its bustling trade routes, had a different economic reality than the feudal systems of Western Europe. Wealth and power were concentrated differently, and this led to differing priorities. While the West was busy building cathedrals and arguing about feudal rights, the Byzantines were juggling trade agreements and taxation that would make a modern CPA break into a cold sweat. Now, let's debunk another myth, that the schism was a simple case of East versus West. It was more like a medieval soap opera with layers of intrigue, politics, and yes, a hint of genuine theological disagreement. The Byzantines were no strangers to theological debates. They had a penchant for wrangling over finer points of doctrine, like whether Christ had one nature or two, a debate as riveting as contemplating the number of angels dancing on a pinhead. Yet, these debates were serious business, often leading to councils and synods that would decide the fate of doctrines, and occasionally emperors. It's also worth noting that the Byzantines played an essential role in shaping Christian doctrine long before the schism. Their theological heavyweights, like St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great, were the rock stars of early Christian thought. They weren't just rehashing old ideas, they were setting the stage for future theological developments. And let's not forget the ecumenical councils held in the East, which were pivotal moments in defining Christian orthodoxy. These were grand affairs where doctrine was hammered out in debates that could last longer than a Byzantine wedding. The Byzantine Church was also a cultural powerhouse, deeply influencing the liturgical practices and art of the time. Their churches were adorned with mosaics so dazzling they could give a kaleidoscope a run for its money. The divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, still celebrated in Orthodox churches today, originated in this period, a testament to the enduring legacy of Byzantine religious life. But here's the kicker. Despite the schism, the two branches of Christianity continue to share more than a few awkward family gatherings over the centuries. Attempts at reconciliation were made, like the Council of Florence in 1439, which was less about resolving theological differences and more about agreeing not to bring up old arguments at dinner. While these attempts often fell flat, they underscore a central truth. Religious division is rarely as straightforward as it seems on the surface. In the Byzantine Empire, religion wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a tool of statecraft. Emperors wielded Christianity like a diplomatic sword, using it to forge alliances or wage wars. The conversion of the Slavs, for instance, was less about spreading the good word and more about extending Byzantine influence into Eastern Europe. Missionary work was strategic, a way to bolster both the empire's borders and its coffers. Byzantine ecclesiastical politics were a tangled web that would make any modern political strategist nod in grim admiration. The Patriarch of Constantinople was a key player, often involved in the delicate dance of power with the emperor. Sometimes they were allies, other times rivals, but their relationship was always a balancing act. The emperor had to keep the Patriarch on side to maintain legitimacy, while the Patriarch needed imperial support to wield influence. It was a relationship as complex and fraught as any high-stakes political drama. As we move forward in our exploration of Byzantine influence, keep this in mind. Their legacy was a tapestry woven with threads of faith, power, and culture. The Great Schism wasn't just a theological rupture. It was a reflection of a world where religion and politics were inseparably entwined. And while the Byzantines might have been divided from their Western counterparts, their impact on the Christian world was anything but diminished. So, as we leave behind the theological debates and ecclesiastical rivalries of the Byzantines, let's remember that their story is far from over. There's more to this tale, with twists and turns that will take us deeper into the heart of an empire that shaped the course of history in ways both profound and unexpected. Stay tuned, because the Byzantine saga is just warming up. As the Byzantine Empire's saga unfolds, its influence on medieval Europe is a story of cultural osmosis, where art, architecture, and ideas seeped across borders like a slow, inevitable tide. Byzantine art was the visual equivalent of a rock concert, bold, vibrant, and impossible to ignore. Mosaics, that quintessential Byzantine art form, were like the Instagram influencers of their time, setting trends that echoed far beyond the empire's borders. These glittering assemblages of glass and stone adorned churches and palaces, turning sacred spaces into celestial visions. The meticulous craftsmanship involved was astonishing, often requiring thousands of tiny tesserae to complete a single image, a labor of love that would make a modern-day pixel artist weep. The architectural legacy, however, is where the Byzantines really flexed their creative muscles. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, with its massive dome, was the architectural equivalent of a mic drop. When it was completed in 537 AD, it boasted the largest interior space in the world, a feat that would remain unchallenged for nearly 1,000 years. Its design was revolutionary, with a central dome that seemed to float on a halo of light, thanks to cleverly concealed windows. This was architecture as theater, a building that was both a place of worship and an engineering marvel. Western architects would eventually look to the Hagia Sophia for inspiration, incorporating its elements into their own designs. Gothic cathedrals, with their soaring spires and intricate facades, owe a nod to this Byzantine masterpiece, an acknowledgement that sometimes the best ideas are borrowed. But the Byzantines weren't just about grand gestures. Their influence also percolated through the minutiae of daily life. Byzantine silk, for instance, was the haute couture of medieval Europe, coveted by kings and queens alike. This wasn't just any fabric. It was produced through a closely guarded process that involved silkworms, mulberry leaves, and a lot of patience. By the 9th century, the Byzantines had established a thriving silk industry, effectively breaking China's monopoly on the material. Silk became a symbol of wealth and power, draping emperors and empresses in shimmering elegance. This trade wasn't just about fashion. It was a conduit for cultural exchange, with patterns and techniques spreading across continents like a silk road of ideas. Let's not forget the Byzantine knack for iconography, a form of religious art that became a cornerstone of Orthodox Christianity. These icons, often painted in vivid hues on wooden panels, were more than just images. They were conduits to the divine. The Byzantines believed that icons served as windows to the spiritual world, a belief that was both revered and at times hotly contested. The iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries saw waves of icon destruction, a conflict that revealed deep divisions within Byzantine society. Yet, despite the turmoil, icons endured, their influence echoing through Eastern Orthodox traditions to this day. Now, let's tackle the myths that swirl around Byzantium like a fog of nostalgia. The empire is often portrayed as a mysterious, exotic realm, a land of opulence and intrigue where emperors donned gold-threaded robes and scheming courtiers whispered in shadowed corridors. While it's true that Byzantine court life could be as elaborate as a Netflix drama, this image glosses over the gritty realities of an empire in perpetual flux. Byzantine power was as much about pragmatic governance as it was about pageantry. Emperors were not just ceremonial figureheads. They were canny politicians and military strategists, navigating a landscape rife with shifting alliances and existential threats. Economically, the Byzantine Empire was a powerhouse, its tentacles stretching across the Mediterranean and beyond. Constantinople, with its strategic location, was a nexus of trade, its markets bustling with goods from Asia, Africa, and Europe. This was an empire built on commerce, where merchants rubbed shoulders with aristocrats, and fortunes could be made or lost in a single transaction. Yet, the Byzantine economy was not immune to the vicissitudes of history. War, plague, and political upheaval took their toll, and by the 13th century, the empire's economic might had waned, a shadow of its former glory. In assessing the Byzantine legacy, it's crucial to sift fact from fantasy. The romanticized vision of Byzantium as a land of eternal splendor is seductive, but the truth is more nuanced. The empire was a complex entity, a tapestry of contradictions where innovation coexisted with tradition and opulence masked underlying fragility. Its influence on medieval Europe was profound, yet it was not always recognized or acknowledged. Western Europe, emerging from the so-called Dark Ages, often saw Byzantium as both a cultural beacon and a political rival. The Byzantine contribution to the Renaissance, for example, was significant, yet often overshadowed by the achievements of Western scholars. The transmission of classical knowledge from east to west was a pivotal moment in European history, a reminder that the Renaissance was not a solo act, but a collaborative endeavor. So, as we wrap up this journey through Byzantine history, let's remember that the empire's legacy is not just a collection of artifacts and architectural wonders. It's a testament to the resilience of a civilization that navigated the turbulent waters of history with a combination of cunning, creativity, and sheer tenacity. The Byzantines may not have always received the accolades they deserved, but their influence is woven into the fabric of European history, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can create wonders that endure through the ages. In the end, the Byzantine Empire was a masterclass in adaptation, a civilization that thrived on the edge of chaos, always reinventing itself in response to changing circumstances. Its story is a cautionary tale about the perils of complacency, but also an inspiring saga of resilience and innovation. Whether through grand architectural feats, artistic masterpieces, or the subtle currents of trade and diplomacy, the Byzantines left an indelible mark on the world, a legacy that continues to captivate and challenge us to look beyond romanticized narratives and appreciate the complexity of history in all its messy, fascinating glory.